Are we ready?
All right.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the organizer of today's symposium, Dr. Liliana, Conlisk, Gallegos, and Professor Poole for inviting me to give a few welcome remarks about this very riveting and very historically relevant talk on fascism. And as you could see, it's not just the United States. In Europe, right, the most recent election, the brother in Italy's huge win in Italy, where the leader of the brother in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, she's a descendant of Mussolini. Her far-right party won. And you also see in Hungary, they set up the fences, right, around their border to prevent Syrian refugees entering Hungary. And you can see United States, right, a political movement here. So I'm really excited today's symposium that bring 6 speakers from different discipline and also on different kind of their academic, intellectual trajectory as well to share their insights. So we'll hear from Professor Dr. Nick Bratcher from the music department. He's going to talk about the fascism, how does it relate to education? And also, if we have time, he would also talk about fascism, how does it relate to the pop culture that's related in, the Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings. So I'm looking forward to his talk. And also, Professor and Dr. Dave Carlson, the chair of English department, he's going to talk about the definition of fascism. And Professor and Dr. Liliana Gallegos, she's going to tie Nazism and white colonialism and fascism together. And next, we'll hear our MFA student, Amber Easley. She's going to talk about the imagery and how does that imagery, say for example, in the social media, especially far right, aesthetics, how does that propel and accelerate the introduction of fascism into mainstream? Yet again, right? We know fascism was popular in World War II, and now we see the rising of fascism. And then we also have Professor Poole, the chair of Communication Study Department. He would give his reflection on Battley's influential essay in 1930, the psychological structure of fascism. And then we also have Professor and Dr. Paloma Villegas from our Sociology department. She's going to talk about vigilante violence that target migrant immigrants and in the Mexican and US border. So again, it's my honor. My name is Liliana. I'm the Dean of College of Arts and Letters. I'm really glad to be part of today's riveting, intellectual, and very timely symposium on fascism entitled Staring into Darkness, and then Fascism Beyond Aesthetics and Politics, and the discussion centering around beyond just arts and humanities, and also the development of fascism that's happening in the past and now nationally, internationally. So again, without further ado, then I will bring Dr. Liliana Gallegos, the initiator and organizer of today's symposium, and also Professor Poole, also the coordinator of today's symposium. I'm going to ask them to come forward. They will be then facilitating today's symposium. Thank you.
I just want to say real quick, sorry, but Matthew, I just want to make sure Matthew invited me to come into the symposium, and I just want to make sure he gets his credit.
Yes, Matthew.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much for organizing and initiating today. Talk and inviting me to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liliana. And thank you so much, Dean Chuang, for allowing us to do this event under the heading of the Cal Talks series, which has been going on for a few years now. And just to say, we're recording this event and it'll be made available on the website of the College of Arts and Letters under the Cal Talks heading. Well, thank you for introducing us, Dean Chuang. We want to begin by recognizing that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Yuhava Viatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. We're very proud to have the College of Arts and Letters at CSUSB host this event under the umbrella of the Cal Talk series. Thank you again, Dean Chuang. And special thanks to Emily McKellar from the Dean's Office, who's helped with all of the publicity material and the marketing of today's event. We also want to thank you all, both our presenters and our audience, for joining us. The event will run until 1 p.m. today, and we hope that you find it stimulating, interesting, and inspiring. We encourage you all to join in with the questions and discussion points as the presentations unfold. And we have built in time throughout and at the end for general discussion between everyone present, speakers and audience.
So thank you, Matt. So before we introduce the topic of today's symposium, after which we will introduce our invited guests, we want to mention a quick note about the proximity of the November elections in this country and the timing of this event. Please note that this is not a party political town hall or rally. We're not here to persuade you to vote one way or another in November. I mean, if you ask me, I have interesting perspective on that. We're here to talk about and discuss the reintroduction of fascism through the resurgence of fascist ways of thinking and themes, which in turn are historically related to colonialist ideology and how they have introduced themselves very openly into the political and social discourse of this country in recent years and what this might mean. Fascism is firmly lodged in American political consciousness today as a pertinent and living phenomenon. No longer consigned to the horrors of the mid-20th century, fascism is now explicitly referred to frequently by elected officials, as well as in the news media and by other pundits of politics in the United States. Fascism is directly related to coloniality inasmuch as it continued to follow a pattern of violence and appropriation that began in colonial times. Modern fascism was inspired by the wild tyrannies of colonialism, not only with its racism and white supremacy, but with its finding ways to justify such horrific acts and attitudes. As Frantz Fanon wrote in The Wretched of the Earth, it was not enough for colonialism to hold colonized people in its grip and emptying the natives' brains of form and content, but by a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This distortion of facts of history is now occurring here in the present, with the appropriation and stealing and twisting of ideas, with the invention of myths such as reverse racism, when there is still no evidence that whites suffer systemic discrimination. People belonging to racial and ethnic minoritized communities still do not have the power to damage the interests of the dominant white supremacy. In a parallel manner, the extreme alt-right and even individuals create a form of self-victimization where any move from people of color to call out racism and discrimination and to demand accountability or safe spaces where white formats and white individuals are not the center of attention is deemed as an attack on white people, when it is actually a response to balance out and subdue white supremacy, a demand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Quote, the impulse behind the reverse racism argument seems to be a desire to prove that people of color don't have it that bad. They're not the only ones that are put at a disadvantage or targeted because of their race. It's like the racism Olympics, and it's patently untrue.
This distortion of facts is what allows fascism to hold a very significant position in the public imagination today, in one way or another. The American people have been accosted with competing and contradictory claims that people on the left are fascistic in their belief in teaching the history of slavery or the history of racist housing policies, redlining laws, for example. In schools, often incorrectly pushed under the umbrella of critical race theory by those on the right. That administrations were fascistic because of mask mandates during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, while offering advice about and encouragement for COVID-19 vaccinations. Accusations from many Republican politicians and other right-wing people. And many still refer to Dr. Anthony Fauci as a fascist. On the right, we see state legislatures banning books, disallowing the discussion of a spectrum of sexualities and genders in schools, speaking at neo-Nazi white supremacist rallies, some openly engaging in homophobic and racist hate speech and other acts of racism, and with little condemnation of terrible acts of physical violence, such as mass shootings, often undertaken in the name of such conspiracy theories as the Great Replacement Theory, which is propagated currently by neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups openly in this country. All of these issues continue because we are still dealing with a lack of justice stemming from a perpetual justification and freedom from accountability only granted to a genealogy of the chosen, as seen in some of those who work in police forces, to major representatives of supremacy such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, to earlier figures such as King Leopold III, Hernando Cortez, Francisco Pizarro, and Christopher Columbus before them, who were not only allowed to conduct the murderous practices that led to the death of millions of indigenous people in the Americas, but who were also blessed by the supremacist ethics of their church and their country. Then there are also more invisibilized layers, invisible to the eyes, which have deeply internalized hierarchical, dichotomized, and decontextualized formats, all practices through which fascist colonialist ideology is still infiltrating our daily lives today.
To the west of Russia, we observe the actions of the Hungarian and Belarusian governments, which have been described as fascist, imprisoning journalists and peaceful protesters, passing legislation to ban LGBTQ+ marriage, etc. In France, Marine Le Pen's political party, the National Rally, formerly the National Front, has significant support in France's general election this year. In Germany, the ALF, Alternative for Germany, political party, has been gaining ground steadily since its founding in February 2013. In Italy's recent election, the neo-fascist Giorgia Meloni rose to power and has been elected to the position of prime minister. Also in Turkey, Israel, and countries in Latin America, we see recent increasingly authoritarian policies by those respective governments that push the politics of those countries hard to the right. Further to this, internationally, Vladimir Putin's government in Russia continues to make claims of Nazism dominating the Ukrainian government, claims used as a primary justification for the Russian invasion of that country happening now. We have been very resolute in criticizing the moves of Russia, yet as a country, we have been participating in the oppression and attempted obliteration of countries like Palestine, dominated by impositions of Zionism. We see masses of women and children being held in cages at the US-Mexico border, being treated like less than animals. They come to the USA from Central America due to poverty and desperation produced by history of violent US domination and military presence. Yet we do not see the same condemnation when we are the oppressors. We fail to make the connection of how those things are all related to supremacist power, to fascism and coloniality. Why?
So this symposium will address fascism today, discussing critically and from different perspectives what it is, the diverse ways in which it works, historical and contemporary instances of it, and what the ramifications of it are as a political system and ideology. We'll also explore whether fascism can even be accurately identified today, or whether political ideologies in general have become so hybridized, atomized, and mutated that they're now impossible to define and distinguish when using contemporary discourse. And so, taking inspiration from Walter Benjamin's 1935 to 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility, where he concludes the essay by writing, quote, "Fiat ars pereat mundus. Let art flourish, though the world persists, says fascism. Expecting from war, as the Italian futurist artist and poet and notable celebrant of fascism, Marinetti admits, the artistic gratification of a sense perception altered by technology, humankind's self-alienation has reached such a point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. Such is the aestheticizing of politics as practiced by fascism." We explore current instances of the aestheticization of politics, among other symptoms of our socio-political sphere, that mimic, reinterpret, mutate, or otherwise develop explicit or covert fascistic programs.
By asking what fascism is today, we're asking how the social and political landscape is now constituted in ways that are new and surprising. Much of this is clearly dangerous and perilous for democracy and the constitution of a republic such as the United States of America. We also ask where the arts and humanities sit in relation to these developments in aesthetics and politics and the new evolutions of the aestheticization of the political that we see all around us. Do we have the courage to ask the necessary questions, to really look deep in the mirror and stare into the engulfing darkness?
And so with that all said, we're delighted now to introduce our invited guest speakers, Dr. Nicholas Bratcher of the Department of Music, Dr. David Carlson of the Department of English, artist and designer Amber Easley, who is an MFA in Studio Art candidate in the Department of Art and Design, and Dr. Paloma Villegas of the Department of Sociology. Please join us in welcoming them.
The structure of the symposium is that we will have 2 rounds of 10-minute presentations by all of our speakers, followed by discussions. So each speaker will talk for 10 minutes, then we'll take questions from the audience. And then after that, there will be a second round of 10-minute presentations, reflections by our 6 panelists. And then we will end with a longer discussion again with questions and comments from the audience. So to start the event, we're delighted to introduce Dr. Nicholas Bratcher.
And I'll just read a brief bio for Dr. Bratcher. Dr. Nicholas Bratcher is Associate Professor of Music, Director of Bands, and Coordinator for Music Education at CSUSB. In addition to ensembles, Nicholas teaches courses in music education, conducting, and diversity in musicology. He's an active guest conductor, clinician, adjudicator, and researcher. Dr. Bratcher has presented clinics on DEI in music education across numerous states and researched wind band pedagogy and literature in multiple countries. Nicholas is author of the book Rainbow Jukebox, a concise companion for LGBTQ music studies. And in September 2022, he and the CSUSB Chamber Winds released their debut album, Some Notes Between Friends, which can be streamed on Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube Music. So over to you, Dr. Bratcher. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me, and I will go ahead and begin in the interest of time. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today briefly is fascism, education, and the implications of what right-wing pundits are now calling CRT, or critical race theory. So first, I think it's clear to note what we need to figure out is what exactly is fascism with regards to this. So fascism is rooted in a history of highly divisive and destructive European movements that arose in the era between World Wars I and II. Most experts would agree that fascism is a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of both the nation and the single powerful leader over the individual citizen. And many see fascism as a revolutionary topic due to advocating for the overthrowing of existing systems of government, as well as the persecution of political enemies. And fascism, when advancing its own interests, regimes can also be highly conservative in their championing of traditional values related to the role of women, marginalized groups such as racial ethnic groups, LGBTQIA+ people, as well as a social hierarchy and obedience to authority. Now, when we look at characteristics of fascism, we look at three main types. We have extreme nationalism, where fascist leaders believe in the supremacy of a certain group of people based on characteristics. Again, these can be race, religion, ethnicity, as well as nationality. The second is a cult of personality. Most fascist regimes cultivate images of their leaders as great figures to be loved and admired, often through mass media and propaganda. I'm sure we've seen images of, Mussolini riding on a horse, shirtless, in order to express the virility and the strength of his leadership in that sense. We also look at a popular mobilization, where fascist regimes demand public participation in society through government organized channels. And so previous leaders would draw massive crowds and rallies intended to stir up enthusiasm for the country, the party, and the leader, thus controlling the hearts and minds of their citizens. And again, these are things that have slowly etched their way back into American society today. Now, when we look at those stages of fascism, really quick, the first one is emerging out of disillusionment. Okay, the second is establishing a legitimacy as politicians. The third is gaining power via right-wing partnerships. The fourth is using that power to dominate institutions. And in my lecture, so to speak, that institution will be education. And then 5 is implementing radical reforms, as we've seen, as Liliana was speaking of earlier, with CR or educators being coupled under the guise of CRT when teaching historically based facts in school systems today. Now, one thing that we need to note in the interest of education is, if you are not familiar with the historical nuances of education within the American school system, every bit of social change that we have had in American history has been proven or dictated by a classroom setting. So if we look at, for example, our increase in technology and how we got a man on the moon. We got to that point because when the Russians successfully launched Sputnik in 1957, and America could not even get a satellite off of the ground, the Russians then go on to launch another Sputnik with a live dog inside that successfully orbits the Earth. And so Americans were in a state of fear and panic. And so then President Eisenhower makes the National Defense Education Act, where he literally feels that the best defense for the country is through our school system. So now we are now going from a point of making, fancy household appliances and cars to now focusing on our students' education within the classrooms in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And to the point to where we are literally pouring federal funding. This is the first example in American history where federal funding has been used to supplement state school education. We also look forward a couple of years, because then we have the challenge of communism versus democracy, and which side the rest of the world wants to fall under. And while we're preaching a democracy aspect and Russia is preaching a communism aspect, Russia makes plain that, you really don't want to be in a democracy, because look at how democracies treat their citizens. And of course, this was around the time when cameras were being, used prevalently, and the rest of the world could see what was happening in America. And of course, what Russia's referring to is the mistreatment of people of color in America, specifically Black people, as it relates to the civil rights movement and counter sit-ins, protest marches, things of that sort. And so the rest of the world is able to see that. And so I have opinions on this, but vicariously in 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. And so now we have the proving ground of these changes, which of course happened in 1954, 10 years later with Brown versus the Board of Education, where they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson that said that separate but equal was constitutional. Brown versus Board of Education came back and said that it was not constitutional, and thus leading to the integration of schools across the country, which still, if we're being honest, has not 100% been fully implemented. There are still school systems within our country, most of which are in the Deep South, that have yet to be integrated from this. But, you know, progress is what we're working towards. Now, when we look at that, we also want to look at critical race theory, or what people are now viewing critical race theory as. So what exactly is critical race theory for those of you who may not be familiar with the actual concept? And critical race theory is or CRT, is a 4 decades old academic framework that holds that racism in and of itself is a social, legal, and political construct that is, quote, not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but something that is embedded in legal systems and policies. Now, for us to view critical race theory, it goes under 5 tenets. So we look at counter storytelling, which is essentially magnifying the stories and experiences and narratives and truths of underrepresented communities. However, even when it's done that, most of the time it is told or done by the dominant cultures. All one has to do is look at movies, history, textbooks, any kind of fictional works, academic frameworks, and media are still pretty much predominantly centered around a dominant culture. And even when giving power to those individuals and communities, counter storytelling fights against that dominant culture narrative and that lack of knowledge and wisdom that minority individuals hold about themselves and their traditions. The second tenet about CRT is the permanence of racism. And what that does is suggest that racism controls the political, social, and economic realms of the United States society. And as Professor Poole mentioned earlier in the 1930s with redlining, where literally they would draw red lines around communities predominantly inhabited by minority people, and as such, banks would deny those communities in those red lines loans during that time. So economically, they could not prosper during that time. And then the third tenet of CRT is whiteness as a property. So due to the embedded nature of racism in society, whiteness is a property interest. And so as a result, you know, they see this as a possession to the right of use and enjoyment, to the right of disposition, and then to the right of inclusion. And so, for example, someone might say, you know, I support freedom of speech, but just not this or that, which is what we see that's happening in society today. And then the fourth tenet is an interest conversion, which is a notion that whites will allow and support racial justice and progress to the extent that there's something positive in it for them. Or a convergence of interest between whites and people of color. And I'll speak on that in my second presentation today when I talk about fascism in comic and fantasy cinematic universes, particularly those of Disney, Marvel, and the Lucasfilm franchises. But civil rights only gave basic rights to minority people, whereas whites had enjoyed it for centuries. And in effect, those created a lot of superficial opportunities. And then the final tenet of CRT is the critique of liberalism, which stems from the idea of colorblindness and the neutrality of the law. And so it basically allows for white people to feel consciously irresponsible for the hardships people of color have faced and encountered, which is what a lot of politicians are using now. So when we look at those things of CRT and what they imply as far as what they do for minority communities, we only have to look at 1930s redlining. We look at targeting Black Americans on the war on drugs. We look at the constitutional definitions of African Americans when they literally counted as 3/5 of a person. And of course, chattel slavery, and then Plessy versus Ferguson, which I mentioned earlier, and then voter suppression policies, which are still working in effect today in states such as Georgia, North Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, so on and so forth. And so when we have the rise of CRT in education, education has increasingly become a tool of domination as right-wing pedagogical apparatuses controlled by entrepreneurs of hate attack workers, the poor, people of color, refugees, undocumented immigrants, LGBTQ people, and others considered as disposable. We only have to look at, states that enact laws where you can't say gay in classrooms, or you're not able to teach about slavery to second grade students, or they are textbooks such as, well, I won't mention their company on this recorded Zoom, but we do have academic textbooks that show elementary school students that captured Africans who were brought over were volunteered workers, or volunteered relocation, or volunteer relocated immigrants is what they're referring to slavery as now, which is just absurd. And under neoliberalism, everything is for sale, and the only obligation of citizenship is consumerism. And at the same time, this ignores basic human needs such as healthcare, food security, decent wages, and of course, a quality education. And so there's a need to raise fundamental questions about the role of education in this time of what could be an impending tyranny, or to put it another way, what are the obligations of education to democracy itself? Now, here are some perspectives that I've gathered. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, public support for discussing institutional and structural racism grew. Many schools and districts have sought to implement reforms that address race at school. And then school reform sounds scary to someone who doesn't understand race or racism or feels uncomfortable talking about it. And some people believe K-12 students should not learn or talk about race or racism at school, which is very difficult to do because in the month of February, which America deems as Black History Month, we love to talk about people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and George Washington Carver, but then we oftentimes neglect to teach our students why these people had to do the things they had to do in the first place and what events led to those things. And so you're trying to teach about a heroic concept without giving the backstory or the origin story, so to speak, as to why these people had to do the things that they had to do. And again, these are being labeled as critical race theory that are being banned and scrutinized in the public school systems. And then again, teaching of critical race theory is forcing educators to sign loyalty oaths, post their syllabi online, higher education, give up their tenure in some states, and then allow students to film their classes and much more. So teachers are coming under extreme scrutiny. Now, thankfully, that is not the case here in the paragon of progressivism that is the state of California. However, many of my colleagues in other states are experiencing these things. And these laws are aimed at critical educators and minorities of class and color. And this far-right attack on education is also part of a larger war on the very ability to think, question, and engage in politics from the vantage point of critical thinking, informed citizenship, and a willingness to address social injustice. And we now live in a society where ignorance is now literally praised as a virtue. And so going back to fascism and comparisons with critical race theory, there are several facets of fascism that strongly correlate to this, and in several states across the US. So first we have the mythic past, where fascists live in this glorious national past that, and I hate to use the slogan, make America great again, so to speak, but it's very similar to that slogan. There's propaganda, which is an assault on critical race theory, or what we like to call culturally relevant teaching. There's the anti-intellectual comparison. A lot of fascism do not like academes or professionals or people who are, intellectuals at their work. They value that ignorance. And there's also the unreality of, this didn't really happen, or we're going to rewrite reality, so to speak, because if we never teach them about it, they never learn about it, and thus they don't create the empathy that is necessary for them to be instructed and informed citizens of American society. We also have hierarchy, where it's kind of self-explanatory in itself, where fascists believe that, again, that a certain race is predominant or dominant or superior for that. And then there's the victimhood as well, where I think we mentioned earlier reverse racism, where there's technically no evidence that that exists, but there is that. And then the work makes you free, which a lot of fascists believe that, because the media touts benefits to certain people, that, people of color or underrepresented minorities are essentially lazy and don't work, which could not be further from the truth. And so where to go from here, which is the last thing I have to tell you. Educators can reclaim and expand a democratic vocation and align itself with a vision that embraces its mission as a public good. Now, when I say democratic, I don't mean that as well in a bipartisan sense. I mean that as well as just in general, the American democracy. There is no democracy without informed or knowledgeable citizens. And education should be defined as a crucial public good, and it cannot serve the public good in a society marked by staggering forms of inequality. And to encourage critical thinking, education should teach students to engage on multiple literacies, become border crossers who can not only consume cultures, but also learn to practice it. And education should be defended as both the search for truth and the practice of freedom. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bratcher, for your presentation. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. David Carlson. He's a professor of English, currently serving as department chair. When in the classroom, David generally teaches classes in indigenous literatures, American literature to 1830, science fiction, and literary theory. His overarching research interest is in the relationship between law and literature in a settler colonial context. He is the author of Sovereign Selves, American Indian Autobiography and the Law by University of Illinois Press, and Imagining Sovereignty, Self-Determination in American Indian Law and Literature, University of Oklahoma Press, as well as several articles and book chapters. David is also one of the founding co-editors of Transmotion, an online open access journal of postmodern Indigenous studies hosted at the University of Kent, UK, and now entering its 9th year of publication. Please take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So there's going to be some, I think, some overlap between some of what Nick had to say and some of what I'm going to say. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to approach this from a literature perspective. I'm going to start with some preliminary comments, and then in my second discussion later on, I'll actually turn to some specific literary examples. So I guess I'm calling this Fascism in American Literature, some preliminary thoughts. So I think as Matthew alluded to in his opening remarks, there are multiple definitions and multiple theoretical approaches to understanding what fascism is, why it arises historically, what it means, what it signifies structurally. Just some brief references to some of the examples of that. I mean, you have classic Marxist approaches that tend to focus on fascism as as something that inevitably emerges historically out of a particular stage in the evolution of capitalism. When you reach a particular point where you have overproduction and challenges of the capitalist system to sort of maintain itself and maintain the hegemony of a ruling class, fascism emerges out of that crisis. And so, this is kind of related to Lenin's argument about imperialism, but you find versions of this argument showing up in the work of the Frankfurt School scholars in the 1930s and in other places, and obviously into the present. I mean, there are other types of economic arguments that are not explicitly Marxist, arguments that focus on seeing fascism as a reaction to uneven economic development and tensions created by modernization. So sort of driven by the economic resentments of the lower middle classes who are left behind by economic change. Talcott Parsons and Seymour Lipset are two sociologists who have made those arguments. You get psychoanalytic approaches that focus more on the, I guess, psychodynamics of fascism. Wilhelm Reich is an example there, looking primarily at fascist leaders and fascist publics, the appeal of authoritarian personalities, the way that fascism has historically played on a perceived crisis in masculinity that is addressed by the appearance of the authoritarian leader. There are other sort of political approaches in political theory. I'll just mention like Hannah Arendt or Walter Benjamin's arguments about how fascism arises out of particular conditions, such as Arendt talks about social rootlessness and the sort of individualization or atomization that we experience in mass societies. And Benjamin's arguments about media fit into this. So to the extent that we become more and more isolated, more and more disconnected, and more mediated in our relationships to one another, we become vulnerable to feelings of alienation that are manipulated. There are other arguments that suggest that what we call fascism, particularly post-World War II, is really just a subset of military dictatorship or totalitarianism. There are, I think, cultural historical approaches, arguments that consider fascism as a facet of modernism, which allows for consideration of how aesthetics and artistic movements and political extremism can relate. And this approach, you can get very, very contradictory images that emerge. For example, you have Italian futurism, for example, which is a modernist movement that embraces technology, embraces violence as well, and sort of feeds directly into certain key aspects of fascist ideology. But on the other hand, in Germany in particular, fascism arose in a kind of anti-modernism, a sense that technological economic change was sort of undermining the folk life of the countryside. And if you look at the sort of history of the support of Nazism in Germany, a lot of that support came from rural Germany, where you had people who would have been ideologically quite opposed to what the Italian futurists were thinking. So again, I think you can get some interesting reflection there about how fascism relates to modernism and modernity. So I think in all of these approaches that I've encountered, I find things that are persuasive. And I think the persuasiveness of those various theories helps to contribute to the fluidity of how we use the term fascism today. And I guess I want to pose a broad question, which is that fluidity of the concept useful, or to what extent is it useful? Or is it evidence of the kind of thing that Orwell warned about in terms of the vagueness of our terminology, where we undercut the specific meanings of words? Does that actually enable authoritarianism and extremism to thrive? And I think you can see that problem when you see situations where you have you can go to a bookstore and you can see books that on the one hand labeled Joe Biden as a fascist, and then you have books on the other hand that will label folks on the right as fascist. And if everybody's a fascist potentially, then the term becomes kind of hard to deploy in a meaningful way in public discourse. So can we be precise and fluid at the same time? And I guess I want to throw out here, and this relates to some of what Nick was talking about, a definition of generic fascism, and my definition here is taken from Robert Paxton's kind of fairly famous and central book, The Anatomy of Fascism. Umberto Eco calls generic fascism fascism, and that's where I use the title and the term in my title of my presentation. So I think arguably you can boil fascism down to a form of political behavior that involves a few key characteristics. An obsessive preoccupation with community decline or victimization, and Nick alluded to those things. Fascism is a mass movement, and it's a party movement driven by a kind of militant nationalism. It builds on what Paxton calls a cult of unity. Fascism involves a rejection of democratic liberties in the pursuit of redemptive violence. And fascism involves typically the belief in the need for an authoritarian leader who incarnates the historical destiny of the group, that typically a male leader, but that leader would embody. It doesn't have to be male, though, I think, as we see in France at this point. Now, when you work with that fascist definition, I think we're able to reflect on the potential and actual existence of multiple fascisms, sometimes coming from diametrically opposed post-historical experiences and ideological commitments. And those examples can be somewhat surprising. And I'll throw out one that I think might be a little controversial here, but I'll just mention it. You can find, you can apply that definition of fascism to things as widely varied as Garveyism in the 1920s to white nationalism today. And I want to just sort of make a comment on the Garveyist point. You may not sort of be aware of this, but Marcus Garvey actually famously said that Mussolini stole fascism from him and his movement. Now, this is to say that Marcus Garvey liked Mussolini. Marcus Garvey actually hated Mussolini, particularly after the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. But Garvey actually talked about ways in which fascist political practice, or what came to be known as fascist political practice, could be part of a movement of racial liberation. And that's I think, an interesting and complicated point. I think the idea of fascism also allows us to grasp the historical trajectories by which become normalized and where structures of violence become made invisible. And I think Nick alluded to this in that staged, that slide he had with the stages by which fascism progresses. And I'll just offer a brief quote from Toni Morrison here at the famous address she made at Howard University in 1995 on racism and fascism. And what Morrison said was, "Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, and even a third. The move to solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, then another." And I think part of what Nick was getting at, and the need for vigilance in terms of educational policies that start off seeming, theoretically reasonable from a certain perspective. They're about individual rights. They're about parents' control. They're about these sorts of things that it's often not too many steps removed from something that looks much more sort of horrific, authoritarian, and troubling. So I want to suggest, and I'm going to talk about this, I think, in the second half when I come back to this. I want to suggest that thinking through stories is a really good way to sort of start pulling out some of this complexity in terms of what fascism means, how it arises, how it manifests itself in different contexts, how we can sort of think about it and push back against it. So in my view, literary and cultural productions provide opportunities for complex reflections on both real and historical and potential manifestations of what I'm calling fascism, past and present. And when we look for examples of that, I think we can be really struck and perhaps surprised by a sustained awareness of fascist threats to democratic institutions that date all the way back to the early 20th century, well before the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. The concept of fascism also allows us to reflect on the deeper historical roots of contemporary extremism, dating back, and I think Liliana mentioned this before, dating back into the colonial past, and to be attentive to the ideological work being done by the persistent and limited equations of fascism and Nazism. And I do think there's a sort of problem in American culture, particular with this insistent fusion on fascism and Nazism, which I think limits people's perspective on what fascism is and can be. We're quite familiar with the Nazis being the bad guys in our movies. We're less familiar with other forms of power being the problem. So again, in the second half of my talk, I'm going to throw up some slides where we can consider some examples of literary texts that I think can generate some complex reflections on fascism. And those texts, to go back to my earlier point about how long this tradition is, I'm going to give you examples that started back in 1908, and I'm going to give you examples that go all the way up to 2020. So I'm going to pause there, and I will turn this over to whoever is next.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. That was great. Next, I am proud to introduce Dr. Liliana Conlisk Gallegos, who is an associate professor of decolonial media and communication studies in the Department of Communication Studies at CSUSB. She is an anti-colonial, anti-fascist Chicana, transfronteriza new media artist, experimenting with textile, extended reality, and experimental expanded animation. Her research focus is anti-decolonial and includes, among other topics, the traumatic effects of border violence and coloniality, the sensibilities and the acquired specialized training of transfronteriza consciousness, quotidian coloniality, experimentation with art-centered community-based liberation pedagogy, and the use of media and extended realities for the development and open sharing of knowledge production to children and adults alike. Currently, she's curating an international exhibition titled The Future Past versus Coloniality, subtitled Decolonial Media Art Beyond 530 Years, which is in collaboration with the digital arts community of SIGGRAPH. The exhibition will be open during the SIGGRAPH Asia 2022 conference in Daegu, South Korea, with an encore at the Los Angeles SIGGRAPH conference, which will be in August 2023. So please welcome Dr. Conlisk Gallegos.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Dr. Poole. Quick trigger warning, I do touch upon heavy subjects of violence, pain, trauma, mentions of racial, sexual, among other types of violence are going to be mentioned. It is only fascism when it happens to white nations, how coloniality inspired Nazism. In honor of those who have sickened and or died from the physical, verbal, psychological, sexual, socioeconomic, and spiritual violence of white supremacist coloniality. We started this panel talk with a land acknowledgement, which is not simply a box to tick. It means that we're conscious of our history, that we live in the seized lands of First Nations, and are personally committed to do anything possible in our daily lives to make sure, first, that we're not upholding the dominance of white supremacy, and second, that those lands and rights to live in ways which are different from the dominant ways are respected, incorporated, and honored. My years studying decolonial history and decolonial theory, producing and curating decolonial new media art, have been informed by the opportunity to witness the life experiences of my community in combination with my own standing as a transfronteriza Mexicana, Chicana with seized indigenous roots. Our experiences, like those of many other identities minoritized and problematized by the dominant ideology, have forced us to stare at coloniality and its multidimensional repercussions, such as fascism, in the face. The occupancy of white supremacy in all dimensions of quotidian life is undeniable, especially to those who live and witness the suffering caused by its revolting existence. Colonialism is the most influential muse in the Western European tradition. The idea of seeing oneself as the center of the world, the main character of the only adventure, is not universal. The act of domination through conquering, pillaging, raping, and enslaving to subjugate entire nations of people by exploiting other lands for the purposes of attaining more power and luxuries for the monarchs is also not universal. This anti-human behavior has required a carnival of justifications to uphold the pluridimensional madhouse of white supremacist horrors. As we enter the true age of discovery and of transmodernity, when we recover more and more of history, it will become clear that our version of fascism here in the Americas has been led by the historical impositions of colonialism, and how white supremacy has imposed itself in various dimensions in its own multiverse of madness. Coloniality of power, as coined by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, refers to the oppressive structures of power, control, and hegemony that emerged from colonialism of the Americas and which are now embedded in institutions and maintained in conjunction with individuals. Identities which were deemed as inferior in the hierarchical and dichotomous formats of colonialism continue to be so in coloniality. The hierarchy serves to justify a spectrum of macro and micro levels of political and ethical impositions, including but not limited to inconsistencies in rule and law enforcement, inconsistencies in punishment/accountability, inconsistencies in local and foreign policies. For the injury of colonialism, coloniality is the set of lifelong repercussions for refusing to acknowledge a problem to the point of hysterical denial of facts. The legacy of colonial ideals, concepts, formats, and organizations produced a one-sided and decontextualized forefathered matrix, which marginalized and ignored all others. To this day, the experiences of abuse by people of color and of those most oppressed by white supremacy and coloniality are denied through practices of deceit, such as gaslighting, manipulation, lying, mobbing, and conning. The torture for those who refuse to assimilate to the impositions of whiteness, such as civility and the like, either because they refuse to or literally cannot, is a classic tool of European tradition. Dominance used to run rampant across the board today, but today, with some of us, it has to be more covert. In an attempt to maintain power, supremacists will twist and deny truths. Denial exists at a micro level, for example, by individuals who minimize our experiences by pretending to be victims of the myth of reverse racism themselves. And denial exists at macro levels, such as where critical race theory is banned and denied its position in the educational canon because the facts are offensive to white supremacists. This means that only one perspective can be taught in schools, the one that has been tried to pass off as objective and unbiased. Guys, we know there's no such thing. And only this perspective can dominate, for example, television, right? And be openly expressed. These practices occurring in multiple dimensions simultaneously are true to the belief that whiteness constitutes a superior way from a superior race and should therefore dominate society to the exclusion or detriment of other racial or ethnic groups. Being deep in coloniality makes it difficult to realize what the push toward assimilation actually represents. This blindness is evidentiary to the existence of levels of oppression and how life experiences can vary so much depending on what you look like, sound like, and what you bring to light with your mere presence. At the end of the day, all dimensions of coloniality, even the ones that politely smile at you, work to uphold supremacy. Coloniality and its multiple branches include fascism and its spawn, Nazism, and they all function under a perverse logic that, not merely satisfied with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content, it turns to the past and current forms turn to the present of the people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. In all instances, the covering and distortion of facts is the big top that houses the carnival of justifications and double standards of the pluridimensional horrors of white supremacy. In Discourse on Colonialism, Caribbean French Martinican poet, author, and politician Aimé Césaire wrote about the cognitive dissonance and the supremacist double standards of coloniality, and how these relate to fascism, in this case with the example of Nazism, and how the atrocities of the Nazis were heavily condemned in the world, while the perpetual atrocities enacted in parallel ways on people of color around other parts of the world, which, to add insult to injury, are still occurring. And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam, and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped, and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France, they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another deadweight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread. And then one day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific reverse shock. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant, they say, how strange. But never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves. That is barbarism. But the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all of the daily barbarism, that is Nazism, yes. But that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. He is being inconsistent, and at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the N-words of Africa. In American Indian Holocaust and Survival, Cherokee anthropologist Russell Thornton roughly estimates 12 million deaths of American Indians due to the colonial violence and practices between 1492 and 1900 across the US. To this number, we must add the untimely and expedited deaths of indigenous peoples across the entirety of Abya Yala, or the place we now refer to as the American continents. In American Holocaust, Conquest of the New World, historian David Stannard reports that the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere declined more than 100 million people. We know these numbers only scratch the surface, as they do not include the deaths of those marginalized by supremacist, ableist, heteropatriarchies around the world. Nor do they include the deaths of people of color from negligence in the medical field, abuses in the judicial and prison system, police violence, racist immigration laws, and the decrease in overall quality of life for those who constantly have to fight off policing and aggression from supremacists in their daily lives. French-Tunisian writer Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized also explains how the relationship between colonialism, fascism, and the current acceptable forms of fascist white supremacy around the world are difficult to understand for those shielded from oppression and who believe in the myths of modernity, white victimhood, reverse racism, and the like, which they exploit to cover rotten behavior and maintain their location of privilege. What is fascism if not a regime of oppression for the benefit of a few? The entire administrative and political machinery of a colony has no other goal. The severest exploitation founded on inequality and contempt guaranteed by police authoritarianism. There is no doubt in the minds of those who have lived through it that colonialism is one variety of fascism. This totalitarian aspect, which even democratic regimes take on in their colonies, is contradictory in appearance only. Colonial fascism is not easily limited to a colony. Cancer wants only to spread. Nazism is a form of fascism, and fascism is a reformulation of colonialism. Coloniality is the inbred father-son of fascism. In a world where viruses mutate to have a better chance of winning pandemics, where computers can learn through artificial intelligence, why wouldn't the methods of fascist power as an analog formulation of human artificial intelligence, or in this case, ideology, learn to disguise itself and reformulate into a code, like a wolf in sheep's clothing? And that ends my first part. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liliana. I can now introduce our next speaker. That is Amber Easley. Amber is an artist, writer, and activist, currently studying on the MFA in Studio Art program in the Department of Art and Design at CSUSB. She's also a professional graphic designer. In her design and artwork, she explores the symbolism found in capitalist organizations and fascist groups' logos and insignias, and researches the history and heritage of those graphemes. In her design and artwork, she explores the symbolism. I'm sorry, there's a repetition there. So that is the introduction for Amber. Thank you so much for joining us, Amber. Over to you.
Hi. Okay, let me get my screen up. And oh, sorry about that. Okay. Apologies. I had a technical complication. Okay. Can everybody see? Okay, great.
Perfect. That's it. You got it.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I also will be giving a little bit of a warning because I deal so much with big bold imagery. You know, there's going to be some disturbing things, some symbols, and some bad drawings, which I clarify are not mine. So I mostly am interested, well, I'm interested in graphic design, but I'm also very interested in how design has sort of become very accessible to everyone, even if you're not a designer, and is filtered through social media. This is kind of my clumsy way of describing this thought that I'm working with. I don't have a better description for it, the imagery over 10 window. And then today we'll be looking at post-right online aesthetic. Okay, so first we go back. Fascism knows branding. They understand Hitler and fascists historically understand the importance of creating the aurora, of creating an identity, an instantly recognizable identity. This is a 550-page red cloth bound book, which is essentially the Nazi brand standards manual, which as a designer, I've done a lot of brand manuals and I really understand their purpose. I don't know why prior to finding out about this, I just never considered its existence. And when I did learn about its existence, it made perfect sense. And I thought, oh yeah, this, the success with which this fascist regime was branded, it makes sense that this, and actually it was all, there was an entire sects of, what am I trying to say? There were entire groups. They were the dedicated to solely the propaganda of all this imagery. Okay, so while we haven't lost these we haven't lost the seriousness, bold symbols and thick lines traditional of totalitarian states are still prevalent and widely used in white supremacist groups. And they still make their way into corporate branding. There's some argument as to whether this is intentional or not, but I do think that social media forces us to look a little closer. This is where things get messy. This is where things become not as obvious. Social media with regard to technological reproduction's role in shaping our political aesthetic experience is accelerationist if you're not careful. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple examples. There are many, many, many examples, and we could go down a lot of different holes, but I've decided to narrow it down to these. We're going to start with pastel Q. Sorry, guys, one moment. I want to apologize to everybody. I had an almost catastrophic computer crash earlier, so I'm sort of still recovering from that. Okay, so I think we all have a pretty good idea of what QAnon is. Some pretty shocking conspiracies coming out of it. Things that you would never imagine would make to mainstream. But through the use of this aesthetic, through this very sort of feminine coded aesthetic that, you know, is very digestible and shareable and fun, these like horrendous, unthinkable conspiracies started to make it into mainstream. There are some really odd spaces online, and these places are where memes are formulated. This is a popular incel meme. It's, if you don't know what incel is, it means involuntary celibate. That is a space within the manosphere, which is also online spaces, where men go to express their frustrations with women and essentially their feelings of entitlement to women. Trad is short for traditional. Trad girl or trad wife refers to a female with blonde hair and wearing a blue floral sundress, initially circulated on 4chan and posts related to traditional and conservative values. The original trad wife meme thread is filled with racist, misogynist, and anti-Semitic comments. It takes reading through maybe 5 comments before you reach discussions of blaming the Jewish media for all of these men's problems. Oh yes, okay, so an example here I have on the right is how this imagery, this drawing with this very anti-Semitic and racist origins, this is a meme that I saw the other day on a friend's account, which is entirely apolitical, about coffee. And I remember thinking like, oh man, there's no way you understand the origins of this meme. Like, this is so interesting that I'm starting to see it come into, like, you know, my friend who's a mom and, you know, it has no connection to this ideology whatsoever, sharing this meme. Pepe. So Pepe is complicated. We could dive into Pepe a lot, but obviously I'm not going to do that. Originally appearing in the 2006 comic Boys Club by Matt Fury, Pepe ended up being legally classified as a hate symbol due to appropriation by the alt-right 4chan users. As 4chan's meme culture spilled over into the mainstream internet, pop stars such as Katy Perry and Nicki Minaj shared Pepe memes. This resulted in the 4chan community setting out to make Pepe as shocking as possible. They did not want Pepe to be apolitical, to be fun. They wanted to take ownership. Pepe was not originally hateful, but for some reason they have adopted him. I personally don't feel that Pepe can be saved. Although I have started to see Pepe used in apolitical contexts again, it's still incredibly jarring when I do. As someone who is online as much as I am, I feel that the damage has been done. My only hope is that those who are using Pepe's image do so with the knowledge that for many of us who have been engaging in social media for the better part of the last decade, seeing Pepe springs forth an onslaught of racist and shocking ideas. Let's see. Okay, so I bring back a couple of these images. I bring them here because they seem, yeah, they are offensive, but they seem unserious. That's sort of, I think, the damage of this. That's sort of the damage of like how easy it is to reproduce and share and turn them apolitical and just keep this reproducibility, I think, is where the danger lies. Because they look so ridiculous, these images, which carry forth these very fascist ideas, they infiltrate everything. They go everywhere. And I think I really think that is the real harm. I think that they have real world implications. And I think this is where we start to see the real world applications. This is where, for me, I think that we need to not treat these images as unserious, as silly as they may look. So the incel manosphere, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. It's definitely made it into the news. So there are basically like, I boiled it down to about 3 main tenets of this space, this online space. 1, feminism has overrun and corrupted modern culture. It operates in violation of nature, biology, and inherent gender differences. 2, men can best seduce women / save society by embracing a super dominant, uber masculine gender role, forcing women to fall in step behind them. This is also known as alpha male. And 3, for the men who are genetically inferior or a virgin, as opposed to a Chad. Chad is someone who is sexually active and popular among women. Involuntary celibacy, or incels, has pushed their anger to a tipping point. They use these spaces to express their frustration with women, but also with society for not forcing women to engage sexually with them. Sex from women is something that is regarded as essential to a healthy society and therefore must be mandated. This clearly devolves into fantasies of torture and rape. So this is, sort of the peak, the worst case scenario of what these spaces can result in. This is why I think, we shouldn't write off memes. We shouldn't write off this imagery, as silly as they may look, as poorly drawn as they are. The cost of normalizing hate is people die. This is Elliot Rodger on the left. He killed 6 people in a stabbing and shooting spree in Isla Vista, California in 2014. Just before he did that, he posted a YouTube video expressing his intentions and why, and he directly linked himself to the incel community. I believe that was the first time that a mass shooter had identified himself as connected to the incel community. And it was shocking. It really did push knowledge about these spaces into the mainstream, for better or for worse. He posted his vision of a world where women fear him. And he also bought into the idea of the alpha male. And just before he, committed this heinous act, he posted, "You will finally see that I am truth. I am the superior one. I am true alpha male." And then to the right, we have Johnny Devin Young. He recorded himself, appallingly enough, pepper spraying, just going around pepper spraying random women. And he declared himself an incel and a part of that community. So this is a really interesting one. Dark MAGA feels like the logical conclusion of all other white nationalists and alt-right memes and shareable imagery. While earlier examples use jokes and disarming aesthetic as a way to normalize bigotry and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories while still maintaining plausible deniability, Dark MAGA goes full throttle. Dark MAGA uses meme warfare to amplify its threatening vision, one that imagines Trump as vengeful and destroying his enemies, often on behalf of white supremacy. While dark, the juxtaposition of silly imagery is used to launder much more sinister and extreme narratives through mainstream channels. And it should be noted that the Republican Madison Cawthorn, who lost earlier this year in like this online rant when he lost his North Carolina House seat, he was quoted saying, "Time for Dark MAGA to truly take command." So like, as like normies, we may not really engage with these spaces, but potential policymakers are. So that's very concerning. I'll conclude more of this in my next 10 minutes. So I will leave you with that.
Thank you, Amber, for your presentation. Now we're going on to Professor Matthew Poole. He's former chair of the Department of Art and Design and is currently interim chair of the Department of Communication Studies at CSUSB. He's a curator and writer, and his practice involves producing exhibitions, publishing artist projects, and writing on topics related to the relations of production and distribution of art. Prior to moving to California in 2012, Poole was a faculty member in the Department of Art History and Philosophy at the University of Essex, Colchester, UK, where he taught art history and theory and ran the graduate curatorial programs.
Great, thank you, Liliana. Okay, I'll just share my PowerPoint. Now I had some problems with this earlier today, so I hope it works okay. I'm going to do it like this. Can everybody see that all right? Great, oh thanks. Okay, so my talk today focuses on a highly influential essay from the 1930s titled "The Psychological Structure of Fascism" by the French philosopher, economist, mystic, occultist, and librarian, Georges Bataille. I've structured my presentation in an atypical way, in that in my first 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on some quotes from Bataille's essay, and then in the second 10 minutes, I'll give some context, followed by analysis. So throughout the essay, throughout my presentation, I'll focus on three concepts that Bataille uses in this essay: homogeneity, heterogeneity, and effervescence. I'll also refer to Bataille's overall philosophical political project, known as base materialism, to contrast it with other ideologies and political systems. And by doing so, I hope to show some details that demonstrate the complexity of the concept of fascism and how it relates to liberal democracy. Now, many of you may know Bataille's work in different contexts, but for those who don't, in terms of a connection to the visual arts, which is my main area of research, Bataille was a hugely influential figure in the Surrealist movement in Europe in the early 20th century. Also, Bataille's base materialism was particularly influential through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 1990s for the work of later theorists like Jacques Derrida, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jean-Luc Nancy, as well as feminist theorists Julia Kristeva, Lucy Irigaray, Hélène Cixous, and Bratcher Ettinger, all known under the wide theoretical moniker of post-structuralism. So here goes. Bataille begins by describing how there must first be a dominant, socially homogeneous matrix of forces within a society in order for any form of fascism to develop. That is, in 1930s Europe, a firmly majoritarian and blithely idealist capitalist bourgeois culture. But please note, it need not be just that particular form of ideology and economic political formation. It could be any other. He describes this homogeneity as productive society, namely useful society. He says every useless element is excluded, not from all of society, but from its homogeneous part. Each element must be useful to another, without the homogeneous activity ever being able to attain the form of activity valid in itself. And he says a useful activity has a common measure with another useful activity. He goes on to say, the common measure, the foundation of social homogeneity and of the activity arising from it, is money, namely the calculable equivalent of the different products of collective activity. Money serves to measure all work and makes man a function of measurable products. According to the judgment of homogeneous society, each man is worth what he produces. In other words, he stops being an existence for itself. He is no more than a function, arranged within measurable limits of collective production, which makes him an existence for something other than itself. It's important to note that Bataille explores and explains that such forces in society are only violent or powerful because they're perceived to be so. The appearance of these forces has a psychological effect and a power which is quickly manifest into conceptual and material power, or a hold over society, its operations, its members, what we might call today hegemony. He then goes on to describe that there must also be a significant matrix of socially heterogeneous forces in society, whose functions and operations are seen as transgressive, disreputable, discordant, and distasteful, etc., by those that adhere to the dominant homogeneous social forces. And he explains that these can either be attractive or repulsive. They can sometimes be sacred and sometimes profane. The example that Bataille gives is that of the subjugated working class culture outside of the workplace, of homogeneous usefulness, that culture of dirt and grease, sweat and muscle, illness and poverty, lust and inebriation, which is in public regarded by the dominant homogeneous middle class ideology as repulsive, aberrant, abhorrent, and base, contrary to the lofty ideals of the bourgeoisie. But because of this, the heterogeneous forces that are othered, and so can be considered in private as exotic, racy, sexy, and therefore attractive in forbidden, taboo ways. For Bataille, these heterogeneous forces are therefore sacred. For Bataille's theory of base materialism, as with Gnosticism, the profanity of these forces is what makes them sacred, because base materialism doesn't consider either the sacred or the profane as being either high or low. They just exist as equally violent, eruptive, dynamic, discordant, and potentially disruptive, quote unquote, natural forces. And so, as agents of production, workers fall within the framework of their social organization but the homogeneous reduction as a rule only affects their wage-earning activity. They're integrated into the psychological homogeneity in terms of their behavior on the job, but not generally as men. Outside the factory, and even beyond its technical operations, a laborer is, with regard to a homogeneous person, a stranger, a man of another nature, of a non-reduced, non-subjugated nature. So in this state of being a stranger to homogeneous society, being a man of another nature, of a non-reduced, non-subjugated nature, the working class person in their life outside of useful, homogeneous work is therefore heterogeneous, and those elements of their culture are the heterogeneous forces in society. Now, please remember this reference to nature here, because as I'm going to analyze in part 2, it's crucial for understanding not just fascism as a political system, but in fact, for understanding any political system, because my main point here is that theories of nature are fundamental to all political systems. So Bataille goes on to say about heterogeneity, the very term heterogeneous indicates that it concerns elements which are impossible to assimilate. And he says the heterogeneous world includes everything resulting from unproductive expenditure. Sacred things themselves form part of this whole. This consists of everything rejected by homogeneous society as waste or as superior transcendent value. Included are the waste products of the human body and certain analogous matter like trash or vermin. The parts of the body, persons, words, or acts having a suggestive, erotic value, the various unconscious processes such as dreams or neuroses, the numerous elements or social forms that homogeneous society is powerless to assimilate, such as mobs, the warrior, aristocratic and impoverished classes, different types of violent individuals, or at least those who refuse the rule. And Bataille also explains how the bourgeois Western democratic nation state must operate within its own self-imposed precarious contradictions to maintain the dominant homogeneous order in order to maintain control over the violent, eruptive, unpredictable potential of the heterogeneous forces in society to subjugate them. So to cut a long story short, Bataille explains when those violent, eruptive, and unpredictable heterogeneous forces in society swell and rise to overcome the precarious, contradictory, homogeneous forces of the state, and indeed the heterogeneous forces become the social factors that form and inform the state and its apparatuses like government, the army, education systems, industry, communications, that fascism is achieved and liberal representative democracy is overthrown. He explains how this happens by stating that social homogeneity fundamentally depends upon the homogeneity of the productive system. Every contradiction arising from the development of economic life thus entails a tendential dissociation of homogeneous social existence. This tendency towards dissociation exerts itself in the most complex manner on all levels and in every direction, but it only reaches acute and dangerous forms, that is, the tendential dissociation of homogeneity, to the extent that an appreciable segment of the mass of homogeneous individuals ceases to have an interest in the conservation of the existing form of homogeneity, not because it's homogeneous, but on the contrary, because it's in the process of losing that character, and this fraction of society then spontaneously affiliates itself with the previously constituted heterogeneous forces and becomes indistinguishable from them. And he characterizes the heterogeneous forces in society as an effervescence. And he says, fascism represents the constitution of a total heterogeneous power whose manifest origin is to be found in the prevailing effervescence. So Battaioni uses this word effervescence 9 times throughout the 25 pages of this essay, but it's crucially important to understanding the psychological aspects of fascism. So I'm going to leave it there. That's the end of my part 1, and I'll come back in part 2 to analyze some of this a bit more deeply. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Paloma Villegas. She is an immigrant and associate professor of sociology at California State University, San Bernardino. In addition to researching and teaching at the intersections of migration, citizenship, borders, race, and gender, she is an amazing interdisciplinary artist.
Thank you, Liliana. Let me just get my presentation ready. Okay. So I want to begin by thanking the event organizers for inviting me to participate. And I also want to provide a content warning. I will be speaking about death and murder, as well as negative depictions of immigrants. So I am a scholar of immigration and borders. My research involves understanding the ways that borders, policy, and discourse produce instances of migrant illegalization. That is the portrayal of migrants as quote unquote illegal, and it's used to enact violence upon them. This process, what we may call xenophobia or nativism or anti-immigrant racism, is an important part of how I understand fascism in my field. However, I come to these questions from a personal and political perspective. I am an immigrant and lived with precarious immigration status for the majority of my life. And though I am a light-skinned Mexican woman, I recognize that I can be the target of some of the hate that circulates around nativism and xenophobia in this part of the world. I am also situated in a sociology department and understand my work is embedded in debates around anti-racism, intersectionality, and justice. So I want to begin with the words of Harsha Walia, who is a scholar in migrant justice activism, whose work I use in my teaching around borders. So she notes that the far right is an intersectional oppressor driven by rapacious hate of many. And while far right forces are not fully united with their own conflicts and contradictions, their ideological synergies point toward escalating social warfare, unquote. So the border is one place where many of these ideological synergies converge. You have racists and nativists who espouse ideas of ethno-nationalism and racial quote unquote purity. You also have immense violence against women. Think of the femicides and missing and murdered Indigenous women, although these do not exclusively occur at the border. Thus, there's also misogynist and incel ideologies that affect conditions at the border, to kind of link my presentation to Amber's. At the US-Mexico border, and I would argue more generally in the US, the anxieties produced around great replacement are not just about the idea of a decreasing number of white people, but of specific white people with specific ideologies. So today, my remarks will be broken down into 2 parts. I want to first discuss examples of the ways that migrants coming to the US. Sorry, one second. Let me remove that. The migrants coming to the US from the southern border are represented. And then I will discuss in my second presentation some connections between immigration enforcement, which I understand is part of a broader policing force, and quote unquote vigilante violence. But let's begin with some examples. So I will present several because I want to demonstrate how commonplace these practices are. So on September 27, 2022, 2 white men pulled up to the Texas desert borderland where a group of migrants were in the process of crossing undetected. When the migrants saw the men's vehicle approach them, they hid. The migrants waited for some time, and when they did not hear any noise, they emerged from their hiding spot. However, upon emerging, they were fired on directly, resulting in 1 male migrant being murdered and another female migrant seriously injured. The men who shot the migrants are brothers. They were eventually arrested. In looking at the media coverage, we learned some things. The brothers are named in the stories. Their surname is Shepherd. The migrants are unnamed. Now, this may be a strategy from those investigating, so to protect the identities of the victims, but it is telling that the shepherds have become the protagonists in the story and the migrants are relegated to the background. Another thing we learn is how the media represents the violent act in a passive way. So the CNN headline states that the two men faced charges in a quote shooting that killed a migrant and injured another. So the headline is passive. It goes out of its way to not tell us that the men in the image were the ones who shot the gun. And here are some other headlines, sorry. So we have from the New York Times, we have death on the border, were twin brothers hunting migrants or wildlife. And then another headline from ABC News that says, former warden and brother arrested for allegedly shooting two migrants. So here I think allegedly is doing a lot of work, particularly because the men have been arrested already, but and because they as I'll say in a second, they accepted that they shot the migrants, but their defense was that they were hunting ducks initially. Then they changed their defense to say that they were hunting wild pigs or javelinas. So they told police that they shot at the migrant, that when they shot at the migrants, one of them saw a quote black butt, thinking it was a javelina or a wild pig. Now, I'm not a hunter, but it does make one wonder that a defense like this can be even proposed in the context of a murder. So publicly stating that they mistook the person for a wild pig is reminiscent of the ways that migrants are often depicted in anti-immigrant discourse through the looming threat of invasion that often manifests through words around mass groups of people, dangerous water metaphors, criminalization, or in this case, animalization, thinking or saying that they thought that they were wild pigs. What's important here is that these representations circulate and can generate a response. Think about the El Paso massacre in 2019 and the fact that the perpetrator wanted to, quote, kill as many Mexicans as possible. Just a year before that, in 2018, Trump referred to migrants in the following way, quote, you wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people, these are animals, unquote. So in the national imaginary, migrants and Mexicans or people from Latinx communities are often seen as interchangeable and seen or depicted as threats. Now, another example, on October 13, just a few weeks after the Shepherd brothers shot at the migrants, two men from Missouri were accused of plotting to shoot migrants at the Texas border and broadcasting their plans on TikTok. So again, these actions are not isolated incidents. And only a week after that, on October 19th, 2022, Lara Logan, who used to work for the CBS news show 60 Minutes, said the following in an appearance on the far-right network Newsmax. She said, God believes in sovereignty and national identity and the sanctity of family and all the things that we've lived with from the beginning of time, which reminds me of this discussion of the mythic past that Nicholas was talking about earlier. And he knows, she said, that the open southern US border is Satan's way of taking control of the world through all of these people who are his stooges and his servants. And they may think that they're going to become gods. That's what they tell us, you know, the ones who want us eating insects, cockroaches, that while they dine on the blood of children. Those are the people, right? They're not gonna win, they're not gonna win. So as you can tell, there's a lot to unpack here, but I wanna begin by the linking of specific behaviors to being with the quote unquote devil, dining on the blood of children and eating cockroaches, that position migrants and anyone who supports the right to mobility as quote unquote deviant. Now we know that communities across the world, including some in Mexico, where I was born, eat insects, chapulines, chinicuiles, humiles, escamoles, chicatanas. All of these are important sources of protein and delicacies that are under attack given climate change and pollution. So those practices are used, decontextualized, and then mobilized in conjunction with sensationalized fear-mongering around global elites drinking the blood of children to vilify migrants. Yet Logan's statement also draws on a racialized imagined community based on ideas of family and lineage or blood, as well as religion. In some, this is a white Christian ethnic affiliation. In her narrative, white families are depicted as quote unquote God-fearing in contrast with those of migrants, and again, those who support migrants. And you can think about this as a call to arms. She also draws on ideas of sovereignty. So who knew that God believed in sovereignty? But all joking aside, if we read between the lines, what she is gesturing to is the idea that whites who reside in white settler colonial states like the US have the legitimacy to decide what occurs within the territories that they control. And when they don't see this happening, that they lash back. This includes the decision-making process for who and how people can move, who can vote, who is elected to public office, who can teach critical race theory, as was mentioned, and state and non-state actors who see themselves as representing how they want the state to operate, step in to enact individual acts of sovereignty, including traveling to the border and shooting at migrants. Think, for example, of the Minutemen Project, a militia organization engaged in performative and violent acts to demonstrate their desire to quote unquote control the border in the mid to late 2000s. They created a volunteer program to police the border that created what Nicholas de Geneva calls a border spectacle that enacted fear for migrants during transit. Of course, the acts of sovereignty enacted here rely on omissions and violence, the displacement and dispossession of indigenous nations, the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, and the continued disenfranchisement of Black indigenous and people of color, as Liliana's presentation also mentioned. So I'm going to stop here for now, and then in my next 10 minutes, I will discuss some links to immigration policing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Villegas. That was terrific, really interesting. Thank you. Now we are a little bit over time, probably because Liliana and my introduction was so long. So we apologize for that. But what we can do now is have 5 minutes of questions from the audience, or please feel free to take a break. I appreciate 3 hours is a long session, and we've already done 1 hour, 40 minutes. So if you need a comfort break to use the bathroom, please feel free to go ahead. But in the meantime, those of you who can stay and want to stay during this break, please do ask any questions. You can write them in the chat, and we can see what we get. Or if any of our panelists have questions for each other, please go ahead.
Yes, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for the two of you within your topic. This morning, I was listening to the news, and I'm not sure if you are aware of the attempt to hurt the Speaker of the House, Democrat Nancy Pelosi. Someone got into her house and hurt the husband. So how this goes along with what you are exposing today, where is kind of the status of our nation at this moment with all these discriminatory practices, this hate, and issues of authoritarianism. So I just wanted to have a perspective as any would like to just tune in. I don't know if you were aware of that.
I didn't know. It just happened this morning?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
I was preparing coffee and I saw it on CNN how apparently someone had attacked Nancy Pelosi's
The
husband.
husband
Yeah.
got hurt. He's in the hospital. they are, they believe he will be fine. He will recuperate. This Pelosi was not in our house. She is in Washington, D.C., but somebody went into her house in San Francisco. My understanding was to harm Speaker of the House. So I think it goes along with what you are, your team. And then this is an escalation really of hate towards women. And I mean, I don't even know how to say it. It's just like trying to process what's going to happen. I mean, I'm being really curious about these situations with voters, denials, elections. So it goes along with what you guys are talking and how this impacts our daily life as faculty, as just regular citizens. So I'm pretty sure you will have something in mind, something to say. So thank you.
Yeah, I think just personally, if I could, this is reflective of several other attacks that are happening across our country with regards to a political attacks, so to speak. And it comes from, for example, in some states you have like Arizona, and in Georgia you have people who are using voter intimidation tactics for people going to the polls to cast their vote. And these intimidation tactics are being used on primarily underrepresented minorities, such as women, people of color, marginalized other marginalized groups, because over the past, decade, those are the groups that tend to vote a certain way. And so by intimidating those, they feel like they will help drive their point across in a political scope to gain political control again. And so, while, speaking on both sides of the parties, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, there were groups of progressives who protested outside of conservative congressmen's homes and protested, but I don't think there was ever like an actual attack, a physical attack on an individual for that, unless, and I may be mistaken, but I have not heard of one to occur. And so again, I think it's just sadly, these are the times that we are living in, and it should not be that way, but there are some supporters of a very, very alt-right structure who believes in a certain message that was portrayed to them, now 6 years ago, and they're still continuing to believe in that message. And I think we're getting the results of those.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jackie and Nick, for the discussion. It's so brief, but we have to continue, because if not, then we'll probably go over one. And if we do, I could stay, whoever can stay for a little bit longer, and we'll keep discussing at the end. Okay? Thank you. All right. So now we're going to go back and start over. So we're going to invite Nick to please give us your second part. And then after that, just like we'll go one after the other. So Nick, David, me, Amber, Matt, and Paloma, same order.
Yeah, and presenters can either give a kind of part two, and I know many of you have prepared, or if you just want to reflect on what's been talked about so far, that's totally fine as well.
Sorry. Okay, so I will go ahead and jump right into things here for the sake of time. The second part I'm going to talk to you about is fascism and pop culture, specifically when it comes to comic and fantasy cinematic universes. And so again, one of those things, as well as being an educator, I also self-identify as a blurred, which is an amalgamation of the words Black and nerd. So we'll go from there. And again, comics have been inherently fascist. I don't know if you've known that, but they tend to have these fascist tropes. And due to the events of the past 2 decades, they have kind of moved back into sort of a subtle fascist way, both on and off the pages. And so when we look at comic books, so to speak, we look at, one of the biggest and earliest comic books that, all of us are probably familiar with is Superman. Superman started in 1938. Ironically, by 2 Jewish kids in Cleveland, Ohio, who grew up watching, Hitler's rise in Nazi Germany. And so they created this character, Superman, as originally a champion of the corrupt. That was his original moniker before he became the, quote, man of steel, so to speak. And champion of the oppressed, I should say. That is not the champion of the corrupt. So that is an error of my part. It was champion of the oppressed. Superman would fight corrupt senators, warmongering foreign leaders, people who would oppress marginalized people, things of that sort. He was truly a symbol of progressivism back during that time. Whereas characters such as Captain America literally were created to fight the Nazis and basically punch Hitler in the face, which I will show you shortly. However, by we get to World War II, Superman, Batman, and Captain America, and all of these others were more so for truth, justice, and the American way, as opposed to just being a champion for the oppressed. And so we can see that here in some of the earlier comical drawings. You can literally see Captain America punching Hitler in the face and all the symbolism that entails, as well as with Superman. Now, concerning fascist ideals here, an author by the name of Frederick Wertham wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And we have to realize that during these times, comics were more so placed towards young children, young readers. And so he takes the character of Superman and paints him as an un-American fascist. And basically, he takes quotes from the comics, such as Superman having the, quote, powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. And he is from an advanced planet peopled by, wait for it, a super race. If any of these notions sound familiar to you. And then, of course, this author's crusade changed comics completely. And so there were no more crime and horror comics, but now heroes are super with conditions. And so instead of Superman now coming from a super race, we now utilize science to where he gains his powers from the rays of our yellow sun here on Earth. And so he's just as normal as you and I, but as long as he remains on this planet, that's what makes him super. And so because of these notions, comic creators actually changed the way they portrayed him and a lot of other heroes during that time for that. Now, talking about those type of comics, there's DC, and then of course their competitors, Marvel. And so Stan Lee, who recently departed from us, brought Spider-Man into play in the late 1950s. And so he gets this theme going against fascism called with great power comes great responsibility. And so, of course, it kind of helps to mitigate the fascist ideals that earlier comics had around the term sacrifice. And so this term of, or this brand of comic book pushed comic readers from smaller children to being teens and adults, which is a trend that still is resident to today. And then other projects that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby co-created, such as the X-Men, were created during the height of the civil rights movement. And if any of you have ever seen or familiar with the X-Men, the two main arch rivals there are Professor Xavier and Magneto. And Stan Lee has even quoted saying that he drew the impetus of these characters from Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, respectively, whereas one wanted mutant kind to live peacefully among non-mutants and the other was the progression of their own kind by any means necessary, both of which draw from those two civil rights leaders. And so again, we see a brand of comic that kind of leans away towards this fascist ideal and makes it to where these are humans in conditions that have been gifted with these abilities, but are still kind of living amongst us and not as, you know, gods in the sky, so to speak. And then over the course, as we get to the late 1980s, 1990s, and we start seeing these ideals come back into play and start seeing comic books picked apart, we start to see super fascism, a term called super fascism, coming back, and it's come through the idea of the multiverse. Now, really quickly, the multiverse is an actual scientific theoretical concept. And basically, in layman's terms, there are an infinite number of Earths, so to speak, or planets, depending on which one you live on. And then that creates an infinite number of yous. So for example, if we term today as Earth 1, then, or Earth 1, I am a professor at Cal State San Bernardino, and I majored in music education in college. On Earth 3, I didn't listen to my uncle's advice, and I enrolled in the United States Marine Corps after high school graduation. And so that version of me on Earth 3 would be living that particular life. All the Earths live simultaneously, but vibrate at different frequencies, so we're not able to see our doppelgangers, so to speak. And so that is a theoretical concept that has been shaped within comic structure, to where if you would imagine that Superman did not land on a small farm in Kansas, but landed instead in Soviet Russia when he came to Earth, and what that version of Superman would look like, and how the Russians' communist impact would have dominated the planet during that time if they had an actual Superman as head of their military. This also creates the idea of fascist ideals within comics, where heroes are tired of the way our laws protect humans who don't necessarily deserve that justice, and so they take advantage of the justice themselves. And so again, we have all of these different concepts of fascism that are slowly coming to light, and those have been portrayed in current comic books, media, and things of that sort that you're able to see. And so that is the concept of super fascism within a multiverse perspective. Now, when we talk about the idea of a cinematic universe, for those that may not know, a cinematic universe is essentially a collection of films and television shows that contribute to a singular narrative of character stories and settings. And these are always interconnected worlds in which a number of franchises may exist simultaneously. The three examples I've given you down here to the left are, of course, Stan Lee, which you saw earlier, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the middle is George Lucas, which some of you may be familiar with the Star Wars franchise. And then to the right is J.R. Tolkien, which is the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit franchise, respectively. And so we go from there. Now, when we go back to these fascist ideals with comics and fantasy, is always a progressive nature, defending the status quo through an overpowering might. And predominantly, this comes from the heterosexual white male perspective. And these individuals hold vast amounts of power, but they choose not to use it to subjugate others because they're just good people. But again, as things change, as superheroes and the look of superheroes change on and off the comics, on and off the screen, fascism starts to come back, or fascist ideals starts to come back slowly but surely. And we've seen it in alt-right groups protesting movies such as the Black Panther, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and current Phase 4 cinematic screens, as well as any characters from underrepresented minorities that may happen to appear in Star Wars franchises or Hobbit, Lord of the Rings franchises, which we'll talk about in like 2 seconds. But first, I want to draw your attention to these charts, which, thanks to IMDb, which is the International Movie Database. So if you look at the one to the left over here, how often have people of color gotten top billing in Marvel so far? So these are Marvel movies all the way to 2018. and you can see all of them. And if you just do a quick Google search, you can see that every single one of these movies is led by a heterosexual white male until we get down to, of course, Black Panther. All right, which ironically is the one of two movies that Marvel has created that has earned them an Academy Award. When we look at how often have women gotten top billing in Marvel movies so far, again, you can look all the way down and there's none. Actually, there's none. And then, of course, how many people who have written or directed Marvel movies thus have been people of color. You can see the chart here with an overwhelming majority. And then how many people have written and directed Marvel movies thus far who have been women. Again, an overwhelming majority. Now, these, of course, goes to 2018, 2 years before the murder of George Floyd, which I mentioned in my first presentation. Now, as I said earlier, as things change on and off the screen, fascism slowly comes back. So now we see that there have been no issues with comics up until Black Panther recently, with alt-right groups or groups that identify with, fascist right-wing groups, so to speak, and saying that, they're not comically accurate, or they're changing, or they're diversifying themselves. People have even gone so far as to say the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU, has now become the MSHU, because a lot of its main heroes are women or women of color. And so to emphasize that, this is currently Marvel's Phase 4, which was started in 2020. So the superheroes that you saw on the chart, such as Thor, who of course is the Norse god played by Chris Hemsworth, or Captain America, or Iron Man, or Ant-Man, or any of those, have now been replaced by these people. Captain America is now a Black man, which, based on comic lore, he takes that mantle. But then we have movies like Shang-Chi, which involves a predominantly Asian cast. We have Moon Knight, which is a person of Egyptian culture. We have Miss Marvel, who is a Pakistani American who becomes one of Marvel's heavy hitters. And then we have the Eternals, which you can see a very diverse cast there. And this character, where my mouse is hovering, also has a hearing impairment, but is the fastest among the characters. We also see the sequel to Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, again with an African-American cast. And then we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is the second other Marvel movie to receive an Academy Award, where Peter Parker is killed and a Black Puerto Rican American, Miles Morales, takes his place as the new Spider-Man. And so again, these are all things in comics, but when you translate them to the screen, you see a lot of people who are bullying the movies, boycotting the movies, giving negative reviews before they even are released, simply because they're not the heterosexual, like athletically chinned white men that they are used to, and not of that particular race. And so again, we see how these things are changing. It's even gotten worse in other franchises, where if we look at here in the bottom left with the Lord of the Rings franchise, people are upset because people of color are in the Tolkien universe, or the Tolkien cinematic universe. And they say, well, Black people can't be dwarves, Black people can't be elves. I personally have never seen a dwarf or an elf, so I don't know what one looks like to verify that statement. There are also people who are saying people of color cannot exist in space. Again, I've never been to space, so I don't know. And this is the Star Wars franchise, of course. And then with Disney, the biggest thing has been remaking the Little Mermaid movie, which of course casts Ariel as a Black woman with red hair, which again is a fictional character of a mermaid. I've never seen one personally, but again, people are outraged by this because it is not to be, quote, historically accurate, when in fact it is a fictional story that has been loosely translated to have a happy ending, when if you've ever actually read The Little Mermaid, it does not have a happy ending. It does not end well for Ariel. And then, of course, over here we have the remake of Cinderella, where Billy Porter plays a genderless fairy godmother. so to speak, and people are upset about that scenario as well. And so again, we start seeing some of these fascist trends come back in comic and fantasy lore, with regards to the three big institutions of Disney, which owns Lucasfilms and Marvel, as well as the Tolkien universe as well. So yeah, any questions or discussions about that?
Thank you, Nick. We're gonna hold on the questions to the end. We're gonna try
Okay.
to like get everyone through because we're running out of time. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. David.
Oh, you're muted, David.
Sorry about that. Yep. Continuing on from where I left off before, and I may skip over a few of these, but I mentioned before that I wanted to just throw out some literary examples of engagement. Some of this will, I think, overlap part of what Nick was talking about this sort of period right in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when there was sort of a lot of overt attention to the fascist threat, and then how this sort of shifts over time. But I mean, the first I mentioned here is actually from 1908, which is Jack London's novel, The Iron Heel. And I mean, London's book is a depiction of the rise of a kind of oligarchical state that emerges in competition with socialism in the United States. And London was a socialist, if you're not aware of that. And what London does in that book, and it's a work of, I guess, science, I would call it a work of science fiction. He predicts fascism emerging as a sort of counter to leftist thought in the United States, and he does posit this question of who would win. I mean, I think something that's interesting about his depiction is he gives us a fascist America emerging that really doesn't have a Führer. It's led by a kind of faceless group of oligarchs, and it does depict a kind of gradual emergence of that sort of the kind of overt oppressive power that is epitomized by that metaphor of the iron heel by the time you get to the later parts of the book. And significantly, I think London's book is somewhat inconclusive. It's written from a future perspective, which implies that ultimately socialism wins over fascism. But the way the book is actually written, there's not a lot of evidence within the book to provide hope for that kind of scenario. You sort of have this tacked on structure that makes it feel as though left-wing thought is inevitably going to triumph over right-wing thought, which is sort of, I mean, I think an interesting example to look at. Why is my slide not going? Okay, hang on, we'll do it this way. So another example, Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here in 1935. And this is a book that theorizes what a kind of Hitler figure would look like in America. And I think arguably it's fair to say that a fascist in America, and we have had some examples in the past, and it's certainly in the present, people who identify themselves as explicitly as fascist, and folks who sort of wear some of the mantle of fascist leadership. Fascism in America is not, doesn't look exactly like fascism in Germany or in Italy or in other places. And what Lewis gives us is the ability to imagine what some of those forms might look like. And his fascist dictator, Buzz Windrip, really is a kind of amalgam of Huey Long, the sort of populist governor in Louisiana, a little bit part Mark Twain, this sort of folksy American kind of populist, and part Billy Graham, part evangelical. He has a discourse that I would argue is very, if I can use the term, Trumpian. He has an autobiography that he's written about himself, or had ghostwritten about himself, that is full of malapropisms and anti-intellectualism and other sorts of things. But interesting enough, in his book, he emerges from a kind of left-leaning populism and then turns into more of a right-wing demagogue. So Lewis's book, I think, raises questions about how fascism or fascist ideas tap into economic discontents that are not necessarily easily pigeonholable on the right or left. and can then kind of morph into other forms over time. George Schuler's book, Black Empire, which was serialized originally in 1937, 1938. And this goes back to the comment I made about Garveyism earlier. Schuler's book is questioning whether or not the sort of tools of fascism, or some of the political tactics of fascism, can be used or support liberation movements, decolonization movements, or those kinds of things. In other words, he's asking, can you have a kind of fascism of the left, which obviously people on the right think you can have? And it asks sort of what's the broader relationship between authoritarianism and fascism. I mean, what's interesting about Schuler's novel is that it's probably actually a satire of some of Marcus Garvey's thinking, but it may not be a satire. And people have had a hard time, I think, figuring out how to read the book. And the book depicts an African-American super scientist, super leader who basically organizes and leads a worldwide party that overthrows white supremacy globally. It's a kind of I suppose there are some hints of what you see in this. There's some hints of what Schuler's doing in narratives like Black Panther, but what Schuler's giving you is much more equivocal, I think, in the political structures. And again, Schuler's book is sort of interesting in that respect. Is he actually arguing about the importance of racial unity in a liberation context for liberation struggles? Is he warning against the dangers of that kind of thinking? It's I think interesting in that respect. And again, from the same time period, 1930s. The book that I've taught before that I think is really interesting in this context is Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. I mean, Heinlein, very conservative science fiction writer, writing this book in the late 1950s. You may have seen the movie of Starship Troopers, which Paul Verhoeven, I think, very much kind of took the source material and turned it into a satire of militarism. Read the original novel, it's definitely not a satire. And what Heinlein's book, I think, allows us to think about is the relationship between militarism and fascism, particularly in an American context, but in ways that are, I think, more broadly applicable. Heinlein has got embedded in that book a kind of discourse of civic virtue, of sort of moral decline, social decline, that I think is very familiar to the history of sort of conservative thought in the United States over the last several decades. And I think his book is a really interesting way of staging how arguments that can seem quite reasonable in certain ways, or not necessarily extreme arguments. I think what Heinlein gives you in that book is a society that ostensibly is fully free, fully democratic, but has structures in it that against the idea of difference, the idea of dissent, and that is absolutely built around the necessity for an enemy other that creates the kind of force that allows a kind of quasi-authoritarian society to emerge. And while the bugs in his narrative could arguably be seen as metaphors for a communist threat, the bugs can be any other, any internal or otherwise. We've got Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, which of course was made into a miniseries a few years ago that some of you may have seen. And this is a narrative, of course, this is one of those alternate history multiverse narratives that Nick was alluding to, where we get a vision of the future where the Axis won World War II and America is partitioned largely between Japan and Germany. But really what the book is about, much more so than the miniseries, is about the concept of truth and what happens to truth, what happens to historical memory, what happens to how propaganda is used in a right wing, in a fascist society. And it has a lot to say about, I think, about the susceptibility of American society to those kinds of manipulations, which is, I think, something that Ashley was talking about in relation to graphic design and those images. We've got Philip Roth's The Plot Against America in 2014. And this is playing off of some American history and reimagining it. As some of you may know, the slogan "America First" that the Trump campaign picked up actually originated with Charles Lindbergh and a movement in the 1930s, an isolationist movement in the 30s. Lindbergh, in his letters, expressed a fair number of anti-Semitic and sort of fascistic leanings. And what Roth's book imagines is sort of what if Lindbergh had run for president and defeated Franklin Roosevelt. And so the book is looking at kind of the ways in which nativism and nativist structures sort of are deeply embedded within the fabric of American society and in the kind of heroes that we put forward, and how those structures can be manipulated. And I guess my last example here ties into what Liliana was talking about. This is Gerald Visner, Anishinaabe writer, his recent book, Sati on the Seine, which is a historical novel where he imagines some indigenous characters who have this is a book in a series about these characters, but in this particular novel, they're living in France at the beginning of World War I when the Nazis invade, and they sort of live through the Vichy period and the Nazi occupation in France. But what Visner spends a lot of time doing in that book is drawing parallels between the historic treatment of indigenous peoples within the United States and the ideology and structures of Nazi Germany. And there's a lot of evidence to support this in the record. You can find clear examples of how the Nazi legal codes were designed with reference to US Indian law. There's a lot of cross-pollinization there going on. And Visner, I think, very slyly sort of brings this up for readers. The book is a little bit of a Trojan horse in that sense, where you're reading in some ways a kind of familiar type of narrative about World War II and resistance movements to the Nazis. But very quickly, you realize that this is about a much broader form of resistance. So I guess in a kind of non-conclusive conclusion in relation to the theme of the symposium, the symposium is asking in part, what relationship do the humanities have to helping us address new developments in fascism? And I think what I'm trying to suggest with these examples is that there's an enormous amount of engagement in literary texts produced in and about the United States that gives us some of the resources that we need to sort of pull apart these core elements of fascism, trace their roots, understand how seductive they are, understand how they morph into different forms over time, and hopefully develop the critical resources to resist that. And I say that with a certain amount of anxiety. And I want to go back to the comment that was made during the intermission there about the act of violence this morning. I think it's very much an open question what's going to happen to the political fabric of this country in the next 10 years, certainly the next presidential election and the period beyond that. So I think it's vitally important for us to be having these conversations, but also to recognize that this conversation has been part of American political discourse for over 100 years. And that fact in and of itself, I think, should be both instructive and probably a little bit sobering. So let me stop there.
Thank you, David. That was brilliant. Absolutely amazing. Thank you. Next, we have Liliana.
I'm ready. All right, so can you guys see my screen? Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, so we left off on the code. The code of supremacy is modernity. In Eurocentrism and Modernity, Introduction to the Frankfurt Lectures by Enrique Dussel, he explains, modernity appears when Europe affirms itself as the center of a world history that it inaugurates, and the periphery that surrounds this center is consequently part of its self-definition, the myth of modernity. It develops an irrational myth, a justification for genocidal violence. Modernity, as such, was born when Europe was in a position to pose itself against an other, when Europe could constitute itself as a unified ego, exploring, conquering, colonizing, all an alterity that gave back its image of itself. Dussel mentions the irony of the word discovery as it relates to uncovering, when the year 1492 marks the origin of a process of concealment or misrecognition, the covering of the non-European. Myths based on the denial or distortion of episodes of history and current facts uphold supremacy. It may seem like it's not fascism because, like the Aryan Germans, some of us are, in fact, on the side of the chosen. In the role of the Romantic West in shaping the Third Reich, Euro-American anthropologist W. Raymond Wood says Hitler was inspired by US racism as an avid reader of the Western novels of Karl May and the gratuitous killing of Mexicans and American Indians depicted as menaces to the prosperity of the white cowboys. These books provided in part a model for conducting the type of unconventional warfare which Hitler found successful. In Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, Euro-American law academic James Q. Whitman found that in the making of the Nuremberg laws of the 1930s and beyond, Nazis looked at U.S. race-based migration, anti-mixed race couples, miscegenation laws, and the invention of second-class citizenship as inspiration. And this is like, basically, I'm giving you the primary sources for what David was just mentioning. In Mein Kampf, Hitler said the following: "There exists one state which manifests at least some modest attempts that show a better appreciation of how things ought to be done in this matter. It is not, however, in our model German Republic, but in the United States, that efforts are made to conform at least partly to the counsels of common sense. By refusing immigrants to enter there if they are in a bad state of health, and by excluding certain races from the right to become naturalized as citizens, they have begun to introduce principles similar to those on which we wish to ground the people's state. Finally, a viable and successful racist society." In Nazi Germany and American Indians, Eastern Shawnee law expert Robert J. Miller found a 1928 speech in which Hitler expressed admiration for the white settlers who had, quote, "gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few hundred thousands." When it came to developing policies and laws concerning Jewish people, Nazis were heavily influenced by federal Indian laws and state laws that discriminated against American Indians and their relations, Mexicans, but who, because of their indigenous blood, were considered a threat by nativist supremacists. Secretary of State James Buchanan feared granting citizenship to our mongrel race. The use of biochemical weapons at extermination camps in Nazi Germany was inspired by the treatment of Mexican people at the US border. In Rimsight's Seeds of Revolution, an underground cultural history of El Paso, Juarez, 1893 to 1923, Mexican-American historian David Dorado Romo connects US custom and disinfection facilities in El Paso, Juarez to the disinfection scandal with disinfection chambers. Mexican people were forced to strip naked and subjected to degrading screening for homosexuality, low IQ, and physical deformities. Beginning in the early 1920s, US officials deloused and sprayed the clothes of Mexicans crossing into the US with various toxic chemicals such as kerosene, gasoline, sulfuric acid, DDT, and Cyclone B. And the fumigation was carried in an area referred to as gas chambers. Dorado Romo discovered a German scientific journal written in 1938, which specifically praised the El Paso method for fumigating Mexican immigrants with Cyclone B. When the final solution was put into effect, Germans took Cyclone B first as a fumigation agent in border crossings and concentration camps, later to be used in gas extermination chambers. There are other episodes, such as the forceful repatriation of 1.8 million citizens of Mexican descent to Mexico during the Great Depression. From mid-19th century well into the 20th century, thousands of men, women, and children of Mexican descent were lynched, burned alive, whipped, shot, hanged due to the heavy anti-Latino sentiment of which the Bear Flag Revolt, a racially charged separatist move against Mexican leaders when California was still Mexico by an insurrectionist militia of white supremacists. The sentiments represented by the Bear Flag, who, according to John Bidwell's Fremont in the Conquest of California, Mexican Californians thought was a cochi, or a pig. This flag inspired the one that is now proudly waving unquestioned above the entrances of our state institutions. I'll give you two examples of the multidimensionality of the current fascistic state to send me off. So first, double standards. White supremacy makes exceptions for white nations and people. People of color from colonized countries who come to Europe or the US are called immigrants or refugees. And these are the nice terms used. Yet we refer to white people in Mexico as expats, even when they migrate as economic refugees because they cannot get a job or afford a living or their medical expenses with their pensions. In Palestine, we see people struggling to protect their homes from a dominating Israeli Zionist government while being labeled as terrorists through a distorted, oversimplified, and decontextualized supremacist version of the situation. Then we saw the same people who are crying for Ukraine on social media being highly critical of the exodus of Syrian refugees into Europe, celebrating footage of families being kicked and pushed by officials and showing disdain for Haitian, Central American, and Mexican refugees while they were cruelly separated from their children and placed in cages. Undocumented students that attend our classes right now are being held in the torturous suspension of their benefits and their liberties because they migrated here due to the historical violence and US imperialism that destroyed the balance of their home countries. We are calling it coloniality because we are yet to articulate the successful fascist imperialist state that we live in. Due to the time limitations, I will share one more example of multidimensionality. Monster making, blame the victim. Under a mentality of colonialism / coloniality, or fascism as it's called when it happens to white people and nations, the marginalized are often portrayed as monstrous danger by supremacists. Our existence is an infection. The Mexican people who inhabited these lands for generations before white settlers stood up to fight and were depicted as unruly bandits and criminals. Nazis depicted Jews as infection. US mass media has depicted and continues to depict people of color in subpar ways. During COVID, Asian American population suffered hate crimes. People of color are imprisoned at an alarming rate. I had an opportunity to witness how these stereotypes play out at our institution while serving as diversity advocate, president of the Untenured Faculty Association, and also as co-chair of the CSUSB Women of Color in Academia. I have witnessed how people from minoritized communities are retaliated against because of the way we speak and express ourselves. Our participation, which inevitably dismantles supremacy, is interpreted as a personal attack due to the ego of supremacy. In my academic career, I have been referred to as uncivil for not being passive-aggressive and instead being direct, never disrespectful, and there have been attempts to accuse me of reverse racism for expressing facts and asking important questions. I have been portrayed as infecting the institution with my dangerous ideas of equity and inclusion, justice. My close mentorship of students has been distorted as a danger. These accusations will go as far as the mob mentality and ignorance of those involved. These false arguments are the micro versions of the macro idea of white genocide or white replacement. I can tell you that what people, and particularly women of color, experience in places like academia is the same supremacist shit. How are you participating in supremacist practices that institutionally hinder the retention of people of color faculty? Can you see how they stem from practices of coloniality? White supremacy can be performed by anyone, as people can navigate more easily when assimilated to white behaviors and practices. Policing people who have a marginalized identity in coloniality by continuously scrutinizing them, falsely accusing them is an abuse of supremacist power, a way to enact racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, classist, and sexist practices. Those who question supremacy are often referred to as troublemakers, and by important people in our institution. Eventually, the secrets of institutional white supremacy and the actions of supremacist individuals will be no more because society is becoming aware of these practices and calling them out, rightfully so. The words of Dr. King are applicable here. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods or direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. If you perform allyship and yet are prioritizing white tears and placing professionalism over justice, it is truly in your best interest to stop. The good news is that you can change. Well, we will change as a society. It took 500 years for us to get to this point. As the extreme anti-human tendencies grow in ignorance, distortion, and denial of facts, they are inadvertently aiding the world in getting reacquainted with history. Trump was a great exponent of normalized coloniality and supremacy. It was in our face, right? So the full participation of historically excluded people is actually an opportunity for us to learn from our truths. This empowerment will grow solidarity among mankind and also liberate the oppressed oppressors, which are the supremacists, from what W.E. Du Bois referred to as the socially granted public and psychological wages of whiteness. And this is a phony social order cementing white supremacy, which made it easier to control the masses by preventing a collaborative stance toward communal liberation. Finally, we should feel encouraged to speak in our own way, openly, unafraid, and apologetically. I will continue to be myself. and I will always speak my truth. I do it for those who are currently afraid to do so. Being genuinely ourselves is one of the most impactful ways of counteracting fascist coloniality. When new ideas and perspectives or truths cause discomfort, anxiety, or even anger, it is a corroboration of the dominance of ignorance and supremacy. So I say, go on, grab a family pack of tissues or two, let it all out, because white tears will never, ever, ever weigh heavier than the blood inside that calls for justice. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Liliana. That was powerful and I think hopeful as well. I think there's a lot of hope in what you're describing there too. Okay, so next we have Amber up again. So if you're ready, Amber, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay, so here's where I left off. Okay, everybody can see? Okay, good.
Yeah, all good.
So we went through a couple of examples of these sort of online aesthetics that get circulated widely. They start with, they usually start in these really dark places with a lot of people who have fascistic fantasies, but they sort of make their way into mainstream, just get shared. It's the nature of the meme. Things get moved, meaning gets lost. I wanted to point to, before I move forward, this dark MAGA theme. Back here, I started with what I felt was like the most accessible in terms of aesthetics, in terms of how this looks, the most accessible way that these ideas get shared. But as you can see here, this image to the right, this was shared by a mom influencer. And if you were to look on her page, it really takes a long time for you to start to see the hashtags. It's quite sneaky, her approach to it. So to see this image was actually really jarring for me. I've been looking at her page for a while, and I thought, oh my gosh, like she really took a deep dive. But I just wanted to share how it, in my mind, how this was like the most accessible, sort of entry into these ideas. But here it is right here, quite literally slashed down the middle, being juxtaposed with, the imagery of dark MAGA. And like this, the sort of inverse of color is quite like common in dark MAGA. And then quite explicitly, we've got these hashtags going on here. So I just thought that was really interesting. I was like, wow, I thought Pastel Q was like, at least decently removed from dark MAGA, but no, actually, I think it just goes to show that they are one and the same. They're just these ideas, this QAnon, this MAGA, all these ideas are just being laundered in different ways. To get us back on track. So when I was putting this together, I kept asking myself, like, how relevant is this? Are these spaces actually fascism when you think of what actual fascism is? And no, they're not. They're awful and they're terrifying. But they're helping normalize fascist ideas. They're making fascism more accessible. I'm careful not to claim that these images or these toxic online spaces are, but those engaging in those spaces have fascistic fantasies, and they understand the power of imagery infiltration, which works to numb us or manipulate us into recirculating their dog whistles. This reinforces and validates these extremists and who desperately want to believe that they are not fringe, that their ideas are taking hold, and that larger state forces are working on their side to carry them out. And sometimes it feels like they're right. When posed with the question, can we identify fascism today? I started thinking about the dilution of the word. I inhabit a lot of anti-fascist spaces, and the word does start to feel like it's losing meaning. But I can say this, that I went ahead and looked on Google Trends, and this is the biggest spike in like the past 10 years. So while, in spite of the confusing and convoluted messaging coming from social media and memes and recirculated imagery, as well as the overuse of the word fascism in our current political atmosphere, I do not believe that we're unable to identify it when we see it. And Trump knew it too. I think he kind of gave the game away with this tweet, actually. As evidenced by his May 31st morning tweet. The murder of George Floyd by police brought to the surface of discourse, which was highly crowded with COVID, the ongoing fact of racialized state terror. So for Trump to describe the anti-racist uprisings as anti-fascist was accurate. And I will sort of close out with, if you're someone who makes images, or you just share them, or you just maybe use them to help convey your ideas as like an educator, these are some things that really help me. I kind of give myself an ethical standard for creating imagery and sharing imagery, because I do believe in its power. So here's just some resources. Obviously, anyone can reach out to me, and I can email you links. I just thought this might be helpful. And I think that's my conclusion. This is sort of my own ethical standard here. And this is my silly little meme. I make memes, and I try to subvert like what's going on out there with imagery. I believe that the effect of what we put into the fabric of society should be a key consideration of our work and our read posts. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber. I think that's really interesting, because it's, you know, you're giving us practical advice about how to be careful not to accidentally spread these messages, which have these roots in fascist, white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. I think that's brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so I think it's my turn to go next, and I'm gonna just quickly share my screen again. So hopefully this will work. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that all right. And I may have to go at a bit of a clip to get through this in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the Bataille's fascism essay that I talked about, and then I'll move on to some analysis that explores fascism and political systems in relation to theories of nature. So I want to start part two of my talk by noting that Bataille's short-lived but prolific and highly influential interdisciplinary journal, Document, which he began in 1929, Bataille and colleagues, who were artists and writers, poets and so on, put forward what was an aggressive counterposition to André Breton's surrealism at the time, Breton being the leader of the surrealist movement. Bataille and colleagues regarded Breton's brand of surrealism as being an extension of bourgeois idealism, and therefore not at all as radical as the mainstream surrealists claimed it to be. Essentially, they rejected the surrealists' claims to expose the subconscious contradictions of the dominant middle-class ideology at the time as having any political purchase, because they proclaimed that the Freudian and Jungian basis of much of surrealist theory and practice was itself bourgeois because of its focus on resolving neuroses, and hence was considered by them, by Bataille and colleagues, as firmly idealist. In opposition to this, and in an effort to find a truly radical surrealism, Bataille and his fellow document contributors forwarded what is now known as base materialist philosophy. And under this banner, they engaged in mysticism, eroticism, and occultism in their practices as theorists, poets, prose writers, photographers, painters, performers, etc. So in a nutshell, base materialism is a philosophical system that says all things matter, including ideas. It's related to older forms of Gnosticism, and it develops a theory of everything that rejects hierarchical categorizations. It seeks to dissolve all categorizations in both epistemology, that is theories of knowledge, and ontology, theories of being, in favor of an understanding of the world as a flux of dynamic ontic energies that can't be reduced to rationalizations and definitions. It attempts to escape the philosophical dualism of idealism and realism, which Bataille observed in other mainstream materialisms, such as Karl Marx's historical materialism. So by rejecting the idea that matter is a dead or inactive form, what theorists often refer to as an ideal form of matter, Bataille considers all matter to be agential, to have agency. And here's a picture of him looking at some matter, which I thought might be quite funny and interesting. The main point is that Bataille's base materialism is an aggressive critique of both the rampant idealism of bourgeois liberal capitalist culture and a carefully nuanced critique of socialist and communist materialisms in the work of Feuerbach, Marx, and Engels, whose theories of nature don't go far enough towards a non-contradictory materialism because of the residual idealization of nature forming their philosophical basis. It's a philosophical and political system that is based on the heterogeneous effervescence that Bataille describes as a foundation of fascism. So there's really interesting overlap here. And it's really carefully, that line is really carefully tread by, or trodden by Bataille. So back to Bataille's fascism essay and those terms, homogeneity, heterogeneity, and effervescence. Bataille describes how heterogeneous fascist society must exist in even more starkly contradictory conditions than homogeneous social constructions like liberal democracy, and that it is the prevailing effervescence of the heterogeneous forces inherent to fascism that veil these stark contradictions in a cruel psychological trick that makes the unresolved contradictions and inequities in fascist societies appear to be natural conditions. The psychological trick is that the generalized effervescence makes members of fascist society feel like their conditions of existence are inevitable or natural, because such effervescence is fueled by and produces primarily affect. So first, Bataille describes how fascism operates in an involuted, what we can call an involuted aristocratic manner. In that, aristocracies are based on a religious ideology with a military structure, but the institutions of religion and the military are kept separate in aristocracies. However, simultaneously, fascism rejects aristocracy as a dominant social organizing structure because fascism is, after all, a populist political form. And Bataille says that in the first place, fascist power is characterized by a foundation that is both religious and military, in which these two habitually distinct elements cannot be separated. It thus presents itself from the outset as an accomplished concentration. So similarly, as I mentioned before, Bataille shows us that fascisms typically have a transcendental quality, a quasi-religious structure, where a real living entity is the focus and embodiment of the transcendental ideals of the fascist society, but yet that someone, the leader, that group, the party, or that construct, the nation, is real, concrete, and human. In that it's important that the leader, for example, could be any one of us. They're not divinely ordained like kings, but they're not just anyone once they're the leader either. They're a figure of devotion like a king. Okay, I'm just going to skip on to that. In this, fascisms are profoundly contradictory in that they're simultaneously idealist and realist, which explains, for example, why totalitarian governments like fascist governments have always favored social realism in art over abstraction, for example. Social realism in art depicts highly idealized scenes in a realist manner and operates with the propagandistic intent one's feelings about reality into the narrow and rigid perspective of the prevailing ideals of society. And there's an example of that here. This is sort of social realism, as are these. And I've chosen an American example on the left there and a German example on the right. So Bataille goes on to say, thus, qualities characteristic of two dominations, internal and external, military and religious, are simultaneously applied in fascism. Qualities derived from the introjected homogeneity, such as duty, discipline, and obedience, and qualities derived from the essential heterogeneity, imperative violence, and the positioning of the chief as the transcendent object of collective affectivity. So you get those two elements holding in sort of lockstep, this complex, or this condensation, as he calls it. And he goes on to say, but the religious value of the chief is really the fundamental, if not formal, value of fascism. The activity of the militiaman is characteristic affective tonality, distinct from that of the soldier in general. The chief as such is in fact only the emanation of a principle which is none other than that of the glorious existence of a nation raised to the value of a divine force, which, superseding every other conceivable consideration, demands not only passion but ecstasy from its participants. And I think a lot of what we're reading here in Bataille's quotes, we can observe that around the world, not least in the United States. So when Bataille writes that fascism therefore appears first of all as a concentration and, so to speak, a condensation of power, he accompanies this with a footnote that reads, condensation of superiority is evidently related to a latent inferiority complex. I think that relates to some of what Amber was talking about, but certainly to about fascist discourse that exists right now in the United States. Make America great again. Well, what was wrong with America? It's an inferiority complex. Such a complex has equally strong roots in both Italy and Germany, in the 30s, of course. This is why, even if fascism developed subsequently in regions having attained complete sovereignty and the awareness of the sovereignty, it is inconceivable that it could ever have been the autochthonous and specific product of such countries. And what I think Bataille is saying here is that fascism is never natural, although it claims to be so, and that it must always be imposed upon a society by the effervescent forces within society. That is, it must be socially constructed. It's a cultural and political imposition. But in order to sustain itself, fascism presents this imposition as a necessary return to a natural condition, i.e., nature is subsumed to politics in fascism as a feeling that any return to a previous era's values, norms, or traditions feels natural, and therefore these ideas are imposed as natural. And so if we take this example, you can see that happening in this painting here. In an effort to create a political model and philosophical system that would not fall into such contradictions, yet which would engage the effervescent heterogeneous forces in society. Bataille's-based materialism operates as both a counter-bourgeois anti-capitalism and as an anti-socialist, anti-Marxian political program. And historian of philosophy Richard Wallin, Professor Richard Wallin of CUNY, has called Bataille's position a left fascism. But I think one might also more charitably call Bataille's position a nihilist communism or a vitalist anarchism, because it's founded on non-idealist theories of nature, and it seeks to operate within a broad ecology that reduces politics to nature in an anti-representationalist manner, derived from Friedrich Nietzsche's anti-religious, anti-transcendentalist perspectivism. By contrast, right-wing fascisms, the fascisms we've seen most, are founded on contradictory, representationalist transcendentalisms that eschew extant organized religion as a political force, yet supplant organized religions with their devotion to God or gods, with a quasi-religious devotion to a living entity such as a political leader, a political party, or a nation. And in this, right-wing fascisms hold these entities up as their supreme figures of enforced collective ideals. Right-wing fascisms also, by contrast to base materialism, which reduces politics to nature, they reduce nature to politics. So in Bataille's base materialism, there is only nature and no politics per se. No cultural norms, no hierarchical categorizations, no cultural or political structures, etc. And in right-wing fascisms, there is only politics, but a politics that embodies myths of what is natural. So a subsumption of nature into culture occurs, making the acceptable culture and its artifacts and activities natural or seemingly natural. This is all in stark contrast to the structures of both humanist liberalism, which today is broadly the dominant ideology in the US and underpins our bourgeois capitalist economic system, and it's in stark contrast to historical materialism, otherwise known as Marxism, which underpins most socialist economies and communist ideologies. So both humanist liberalism and historical materialism hold in a dialectical tension the concepts of politics and nature. Humanist liberalist ideologies tend to lean towards politics insofar as they tend towards cultural ideals, and so materials are subjugated to those ideals. And in this way, they seek to develop conservative, broadly conservative elements of politics. In historical materialist ideology, however, there's a tendency to lean the other way towards nature, insofar as they tend towards material historical realities, and ideals are subjugated to these material conditions, and in this way they seek to develop progressive elements of politics. And the battle for democracy in the US today, then, is hinged, or rather it should be hinged, on understanding and revising the theory of nature that it currently has. Because the fascist elements of US society are winning the political battle of what feels right and what feels productive and what feels good for society. Because the rhetoric of natural law is far more politically effective, affective, and effervescent than the rhetoric of the law of the people. In the battle for the political ground of the concept of freedom, which American elections always hinge upon, it just doesn't feel right to be free. It just doesn't feel right that to be free, we must be subjugated and reduced to the law of the people, i.e. to be subjugated and reduced to the useful, productive, homogeneous forces in society. So it's easy to see why those with right-wing tendencies feel that they don't want to be reduced or subjugated in this way, and they want to unleash their heterogeneity, a non-subjugated nature. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Paloma?
So thank you everyone for sticking around. So just to remind you, in my previous comments, I was discussing how ideas about sovereignty, so the right of some people to control what happens in a territory, is key to fascist violence. Fascism is a many-tentacled monster, but returning to my earlier example of the men who shot at the migrants at the border, I want to again emphasize that border violence invites white settler imaginations of sovereignty. So Nicholas Genova, drawing on the work of Mann, refers to fascism in this way. So he says the extra state organization of violence as the self-styled popular vanguard of a reactionary nationalist project. We can think about the men traveling to the border and firing onto the migrants as an act of sovereignty. In their mind, they're protecting the nation from imagined invaders when they feel the government is not doing their job. But I want to argue that these vigilante practices are often upheld and operate in conjunction with formal policing. One way is through police action and inaction. So we are repeatedly told that the police protect victims of crime. However, this event illustrates the lack of protection the police produce for those who experience violence. The uninjured migrants were immediately placed in ICE detention instead of a protected space. But also when we research the incident a bit more, we find that the two men are affiliated with policing institutions. One is, and I think was fired recently, a warden at a detention facility known to enact violence onto folks who are detained, and another works at a sheriff's office. So while they engaged in extra state violence, to use de Genova's wording, they also are affiliated and act on behalf of the state. But lest we think about the shooting as an isolated incident by quote unquote extremists, let's discuss a bit of history. The US Border Patrol was formally enacted in 1924, almost 100 years ago. Initially, as Kelly Lytle Hernandez tells us, those who worked for the Border Patrol were local men who saw an opportunity to act as vigilantes. Before this time, the Texas Rangers engaged in battling indigenous peoples from the local area who resisted white settler colonialism. And I think this aligns very well with Liliana's presentation as well. Now, Lytle Hernandez notes that these men's, quote, pedigree was not that of the land-holding elite, but of the Anglo-American working class, who often used law enforcement as a strategy of economic survival and social uplift in the agriculture-based society of the borderlands, unquote. Thus, the Border Patrol, from its creation, operated to maintain white dominance in the borderlands. This violence is so pervasive that it influenced the writing of stories like that of Juan Rulfo's Paso del Norte, where he describes migrants being shot at the border, and numerous songs, including this corrido by Timoteo Cantú and Jesus Maya, which describes the violent encounters of migrants that migrants have had and continue to have with border officials. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this. Hopefully it works.
Yo soy mojado y nadie sabe que por el río yo me pasé. Y disfrazado siempre he vivido y de los guardias me cuidaré. Les aseguro cuánto he sufrido cuando yo vine a esta nación. Ay, de los sustos que yo he llevado cuando me encuentra en la inmigración. Me preguntaron por pasaporte y yo les dije yo soy de aquí. Luego me piden fe de bautismo y yo les dije que la perdí. Súbete al carro, me dijo el jefe, y yo de pronto lo obedecí. Pues yo temblaba como un parabris de la sorpresa que recibí.
So I'll stop it there. but he ends by the last part that he says that he's trembling as he's being apprehended by the Border Patrol. So another connection, Sierra Pentagill tells us about Harlan Carter, who, quote, led the National Rifle Association from 1977 until 1985, during a period when it was transformed from principally a sporting organization into a radical right political bloc. When he was 17, Carter, who grew up in the Texas borderlands, was convicted of murdering 13-year-old Ramon Casiano after Casiano was supposedly seen on the Carter's property. This kind of white nationalist violence would be a prominent feature of the rest of Carter's life. After his murder conviction was vacated by the Texas Court of Appeals, Carter would join the US Border Patrol, eventually becoming its head. In that role, he ran Operation Wetback in 1954 that led to the deportation of a lot of the agricultural workers, the braceros, which Pentagill says made a spectacle of deporting undocumented Mexican farm workers. So as we can see, men like Carter not only engaged in racist murder, but then had the opportunity to work for the institutions that monitored those who were the targets of their hatred. And Border Patrol officers at that time were also recruited to run counterinsurgency training abroad in countries like Venezuela, Thailand, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. Those recruited to work in Latin America were valued because through living and working at the borderlands, they knew how to speak Spanish and were imagined to be acquainted with Latin American quote unquote customs. And Border Patrol sites in the US were also used for these counterinsurgency trainings. And finally, research tells us many police and other enforcement officers, including police officers, are part of extra state organizations. For instance, Irene Vega, who researches the ways that the Border Patrol enacts and legitimates what it calls, quote, reasonable force at the border, argues that it is an agency that understands itself as a paramilitary border security force and is guided by war metaphors, assumptions of immigrant criminality, and homeland security ideologies. In 2019, a private Facebook group from Border Patrol members emerged that regularly made anti-immigrant, racist, and misogynistic comments. That same year, Reveal uncovered that, quote, hundreds of active duty and retired law enforcement officers from across the United States are members of Confederate, anti-Islam, misogynistic, and anti-government militia groups on Facebook. Some of this information can be found in the Plainview Project, which is a database of public Facebook posts and comments made by current and former police officers from several jurisdictions across the US. So here are some examples of stories about that. But to conclude, we are living in a time where nativist ideas are exalted by politicians and facilitated by social media. But to kind of echo some of Liliana's remarks, I want to warn us against thinking that current events mark a deviation from previous practices. This is why we need to historicize movements and ideologies. In recent times, we hear a lot about proto-fascist or the coming wave of fascism. However, these practices are here and they have been here. Some may seem new, but this is only because they have affected our communities unevenly. There is a privilege in not knowing or in thinking that there's a few bad apples instead of a rotting orchard. Now, to end in a semi-hopeful manner, this doesn't mean that they are insurmountable. We see folks resisting violent extra state practices every day through the act of migration, through solidarity work that unfortunately is increasingly being criminalized, and through campaigns that work to defund and abolish the police and immigration enforcement. So thank you, I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Paloma, por tus palabras and for your presentation. I really appreciate all of your presentations. Thank you so much. Matthew, you want to say something before we go on to questions?
Yeah, I'm really grateful to everybody. I just think the range of topics and the way they overlap has been fantastic and fascinating. But I think that range also signals what Paloma was just describing, which is that there is a kind of, suffused weaving of these problems that exist as elements that could be described as fascistic within society, and has done for a long time. And that's something that, is extremely important to acknowledge. And I was just thinking, the kind of fascist insistence, well, the sort of fascist ideology of healthiness, the generalized healthiness is something that relates to these, awful instances and continuances of treating immigrants in this way, or treating indigenous people in this way, because they are counter to, they're vermin in the eyes of a fascistic or quasi-fascistic mindset or ideology. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a question from Barastu on the chat, and I've been asked to read it for her. And we're going to steal a little bit of your time if you're willing, to the presenters, and of course, people in the audience, also you. So Parastu says, thank you all so much for these enlightening and thought-provoking presentations. My question is for Professor Poole. Do you see a connection between Bataille's concept of homogeneity and the eugenics movement of applied biology, as Nazis called it in the 1930s?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it comes back to this question of, certainly the Nazis had one of the most explicit ideologies of hygiene and purity, because they believe in a particular kind of race of people as superior, based on Nordic and Teutonic traditions, kind of mashed together with what they selected from ancient Greek history and traditions, and so the massive contradictions that were held together by great violence of all different types by the Nazis were all hinged on this ideology of hygiene or purity, because on the one hand, there was a creation of a homogeneous, disciplined, as Bataille says, fascism is underpinned by a violent discipline. So there's an underpinning of what is something disciplined, like an ideology of hygiene and purity, but at the same time, it's fueled, like the political fuel is othering, fear of the other, and creating a sense of a heterogeneous affectivity. This kind of fervor, this firing people up towards things that are other, and that's what the effervescence of this feeling of heterogeneity is. I think Bataille is in a very different kind of realm, in that he wants to revel in heterogeneity. He doesn't want to other the working class or other things that are discarded, or he says literally like trash and vermin. He wants to revel in those things. He wants life to be about those things, for us to swim in heterogeneity. But certainly in fascist ideology, it's a very careful kind of tension where this very violent subsumption happens between homogeneity and heterogeneity. So yeah, it's a good question.
Would anybody want to add their thoughts? Follow up?
Maybe just to say something, again, I think this might be, I wanted to make a connection between what Nick was talking about, what Matthew was talking about, actually, which I thought was interesting, about Nick talking about the sort of the trajectory of the superhero, right? The comic superhero, from the ostensibly anti-fascist beginnings to the sort of more fascistic sort of contemporary manifestations. But all along you've got the superhero as the exception, the figure of exception, right? Which I think is tied to what Matthew was talking about in Bataille's theorization of the heterogeneous effervescent force that bubbles up and then creates this power structure. And that's right in the middle of Nazi political theory. That's Carl Schmitt's theory of the exception that Agamben talks about. This stuff, I guess my point is that in a way, like we're all talking in different registers here and about different examples, pop culture, high theory, but there are these clear through lines that tie all this stuff together if you can pull those threads apart. And I guess this really isn't really a question, but more of a statement of appreciation for I think what everybody had to say today, because I think it really does illustrate that these are in a way they're very complicated structures because they're so diffuse, but there are threads you can pull out that sort of pull these things together. And that's part of our job as educators, right? Is to help people see those threads and pull. And it may be that the comic book is the right way for somebody to get at this. Maybe for another person, Bataille is going to be the angle. But I guess I just want to say I was struck too today by how many points of connection there were between what we all had to say, particularly since none of us really coordinated this, other than in a very general sense. So.
I would like to add how those both homogeneity and applied biology are related to coloniality and colonialism. So a lot of the ideas that, the justification for the taking over of lands was that indigenous people were not using the lands to their full extent. They weren't exploiting them. And this idea of being able to control nature or subjugate nature and make it work for you, it comes from before. It comes from, it didn't start there. It came from Europe, this idea. So, this kind of thinking goes back to the inability to accept things as they are. And in my opinion is, for example, accepting diversity is to accept nature, right? Is to basically look at how things are diverse. That's just how they are, right? But the first thing that settlers did when they arrived to the Americas is to negate that there was already not only a group of people, but empires functioning and working with nature in these continents. So like in that already there's no, that can't exist because we're coming from far away and we are trying to look for a land for us. And this is our land, so if you think about that, that's it's definitely related to homogeneity as Bataille expresses it and applied biology, because it follows that same line that I hope I exemplified with, my presentation, which is like an onion, right? It's the same as the other side of this is intergenerational trauma, right? It's the traumas that have been experienced through generations that continue. You think in your house, the way that your mom and dad or your mom and mom or your parents speak to each other is normal, or the experience that you had as a child, that's how everybody else is born, right? So, but you don't really come to understand that some of those things are legacies of abuses and things like this. So in both, I'm not into the binary way of thinking. So there's a complexity to this. It's not like one side and the other. No, it's like there's multiple sides simultaneously working towards that and against it. Yeah. And in spite as well.
Yeah, I could jump in with something. It is really complex and it's ingrained in such a way that it is really hard to pull apart. But I think David's right. It's important to pull out these through lines. For example, I was thinking of Siegfried Krakauer's essays and book, The Mass Ornament. I don't know if any of you've read that. It's a terrific book, and he talks about not just the Nazis' obsession with coordinated, synchronized movements of masses of people, but also the liberal democratic world's obsession with that through film and then later television. America has a real obsession with synchronized dancing. It is something that is like in popular culture, absolutely massive. Like I can't believe how many adverts for really mundane things have people doing synchronized dancing. And it's, it sounds trivial, but it's not. It's part of a kind of ideological structure and aesthetic structure as well, of what it means to be, a body, a person, a subject in a society. What does it mean to operate in a society? Well, it means to be like this. You have to do this, look like this, literally or metaphorically. And that's interesting. But just one last thing. I was really pleased, Nick, that you mentioned neoliberalism in your part one, because I think the other thing that is really deeply ingrained in certainly US society, but all over the world really, is what is a very, very radical theory of nature in neoliberalism. And that is that we have natural rights to property, and neoliberalism is ultra extremist on that theory of nature in a way that Keynesian capitalism, other earlier forms of capitalism weren't. So we live in times where we live within an ultra radical economic system that has this philosophical base that interpolates us as subjects, subject to this very particular and extreme form of theory of nature, where we have natural rights, in fact, divinely ordained rights. It's theological too, to private property. And that, I feel, is a very big problem in society today, and is possibly, I speculate, possibly one of the reasons why fascist tendencies are more amplified now explicitly than perhaps they were previously.
If I can add to that, I think that reveals some of the cracks of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism would like us to think that we can undo borders, right? That things, that capital and some people can move freely. And yet what we're seeing is how seductive nationalism is, and how seductive these racial and other politics are to, and the group membership is to how we organize our lives.
Can I ask Amber a question? So, something that you talked about, you mentioned in your talk, Amber, that interested me. When you were talking about Pepe, particularly, are we talking about the sort of way that particular memes or symbols get so overdetermined or so wrought with baggage that they can't be redeemed? I wonder if you could say a little more about your thinking about that, because yeah, I mean, that's just an interesting and sort of troubling concept, that there's a point at which symbols become so fixed that they can't be changed, and sort of, yeah, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that particular part of what you were getting at. So
I mean, it's definitely arguable. I mean, that's my feeling. It saddens me that some, especially indigenous symbols get appropriated, get used, and get pushed out into mainstream, so effectively in association with hateful ideas, that even when there are, rightful and earnest attempts to reclaim them, there's still such a shock value, right? I mean, the swastika it's a great example of that. And then, Pepe is kind of a more contemporary and macro example of that. I think that there are some out there who would argue, like, there are people out there, the creator, for one, he's working to reclaim Pepe. I don't blame him. People intentionally, I think there's one, I didn't have it in my slide, where it's Pepe with the speech bubble that says, be nice, man, which is like a kind of a inverse of what he became popular for, was feels good, man. And it did feel good to see that when I was researching. I was like, that's nice. It's nice to see Pepe like attempting to be reclaimed. But, in my personal opinion, I will see Pepe. And I have an enamel pin of Pepe that I got before I knew he was part of the internet culture. And I'm very much so involved in the internet culture. And I bought that before the alt-right took him over. And every once in a while, I still come across it and I'm like, ugh, geez, I can't believe I have that like in my home. You know, I don't know what to do with it. So personally, it's hard for me to shed that baggage, but I also have a lot of feelings. Like I am a designer. I have a lot of strong feelings about symbols, about design. So, you know, maybe not everyone feels that way, but I know for those of us who, you know, who spend a lot of our years of our life dedicating, like learning the impact of signs, learning how to manipulate, you know, that's commercialism. Graphic design is inherently commercial. How to manipulate minds with signs. Like we know, maybe we know too much. Maybe we have too much baggage with signs. So.
Yeah, if I can just add quickly as well, you know, the very symbol of the fasces as well is, you know, an appropriation by fascists. Yeah, I've actually got some images I put together that are at the end of my PowerPoint, which I could show. But you know, the bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle, bound by red leather rope, is a Roman. As many people know, I'm sure you know, it's a Roman symbol of civic authority as opposed to military authority, and there are two huge brass fasces either side of the podium in the House of Congress and the Senate. Lincoln's memorial, where he has his hands on the ends of the seat that he's sitting in. There's two fasces in relief, bas relief at the end of there. Washington is at the Washington Monument, the bronze statue of George Washington. He's resting on a fasces, his elbows on it. And so it's, you know, historically, it's a symbol of civic authority, which is, you know, it's because it represents a kind of populism or at least a kind of a democratic ideal of some sorts. And it was hijacked in the 1930s by Mussolini and then Hitler. So yeah, it's interesting. And so the question of reclaiming imagery is super important, and how that works, and can it work, and what happened. Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. Hannah, would you like to ask or comment?
Yes. Yes, I just wanted to ask him, partly comment, that I find this particular discussion very useful, because not only with memes, I know that in Dr. Gallegos' lectures, we talk a lot about appropriation, because as we know, the efforts to decolonize and just make the world a place that's more open and equitable means that we put stuff out there. And we were talking about how sometimes when people with good intentions or intentions to actually produce movements of liberation and such have their work appropriated by the same people that they're trying to challenge, like where the basic example is that of the Matrix, and like the idea of the red pill being appropriated by Trump and other by Ivanka Trump and Elon Musk and all this type of people. And I wonder, in this panel with so many people who are educated and informed and with good ideas, what can we do to make sure that our efforts, the fact that we're taking time out of our lives and just putting not only our work, but sometimes our own safety out there to produce this, is not co-opted or taken over by people who are trying to not only undermine us, but obliterate us completely. So
It is such a good question. Thank you, Hannah. It's such a difficult, the answers are so difficult. Does anybody want to jump in and answer Hannah's question?
I can start. You made me think about, so my brother used to have this professor when he was doing his master's, who talked about the difference between like a 30-second message and then like how to unpack a 30-second message. Now we have like memes, or we have images, right? So it's even less than 30 seconds, right? But in order, and this is where it's difficult, in order to unpack some of these messages, it'll take me 30 minutes, right? Because we have to do the work of taking it apart and explaining where the lies are, or where the hidden messages are, etc. So it'll take me 30 minutes to unpack a 30-second message. So it's a lot of work. But it is work that is important, right? And it is work that hopefully we're training students to do so that they can intervene in their, their general conversations they have with their families, with their friends, with, in out in their lives outside of just the conversations that they have in classes.
Yeah, I think part of what makes it difficult too is that the slogan or images that are often picked up for these purposes are on the surface, they're often innocent or common sense. You know what I mean? They get used in ways that people resist having it being unpacked in certain. And I think I guess Pepe's a good example of that, right? But I think of like the sort of the America First slogan as an example there. There are some folks who you can point out the trajectory of that phrase and date it back to anti-Semitic structures and sort of other kind of nativist structures. And there are still folks who will sort of come back to, well, that's not what I mean. That's not what it means. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you have often these generic slogans, neutral seeming images that then get repurposed this way, because they're hard to then through criticism and there's a kind of easy deniability that I didn't mean that, or it shouldn't matter that somebody else uses that term that way. I don't mean it that way, and so consequently it's my right to use it in the way that I see fit. So I know that's not really answering the question of how to deal with it, but just to point out that I think there's a strategy to this, and I'm sure Amber as a designer is familiar with that too. The choice of the particular images, the particular styles. There's a thoughtfulness behind this that sort of masks some of the malice, right?
I do wish that there was a recipe for ensuring that our works don't get appropriated and abused. There isn't. As artists, we sort of have to accept that we let our work into the world, and what's going to happen is going to happen. But to be a little more hopeful, I will say that in terms of like artwork, design, imagery, memes, I mean, as silly as they sound, I make memes. I hope they get circulated because they are anti-fascist. They are not neutral. So I guess that's really the answer I have for a lot of things, is to not, to be neutral is, to side with the status quo. And we know what the status quo is. And so make your artwork like unequivocally anti-fascist, unmistakable. That's something that I try to do. It's not going to protect it 100%. People are still going to dislike it. They're going to take it. They're going to turn it around. But that's the protections that I use currently in hopes that I never see something that I made on a 4chan thread being used for malicious intent. Trademarking, yeah, I could trademark, but I mean, that's if I really want to go to the trouble and the time and the money to take someone to court,
And one of the sort of philosophical dangers, which is inherent to Hannah's question, is the risk of essentializing language. Saying this absolutely for all times means this, and this for all time means this. Like it inherently, essentially means this or this. That's an incredibly conservative approach to language, which risks, if anyone who has that kind of approach to language or imagery or any other kind of language form, it risks becoming as conservative as the fascists who would appropriate it for their means as well. So it is a terrible danger, and I think that shows the sort of difference between radically conservative or fascist thinking and say democratic thinking. As I said in my paper, fascism is quite exciting because it feels great. It feels like hate feels great. Do you know what I mean? It's not great, but it feels great. Whereas democracy is boring as hell. Like you've got laws, you've got oversight, you've got institutions, you've got checks and balances. It's terribly boring. but it's got these protective mechanisms in it, which broadly are for the broader good. It has its own problems, contradictions, and so on. But yeah, I mean, so that there's an analogy there to the worry about prohibiting appropriation. Appropriation, unfortunately, just happens. It's just a function of language. It's how languages evolve too, which is a great thing. For example, African American colloquial English, Black American colloquial English, it's just fantastic, exciting, creative appropriations of one way of doing something or saying something into another, but the meaning is still clear. So there's a creativity that would be lost if we somehow legislated for appropriations that we didn't like.
We do have copyright law, right? So I mean, certain things are accepted to be protected while others aren't, and this is why appropriation happens, because there's such ignorance in terms of like cultures that are different from the dominating one, that people don't know what they're doing, and they're just copying decontextualized fragments of something that looks cool or something that sounds cool. I want to be part of this new trend, but like, I don't want to do the work of finding out what it means. It probably means nothing because these people belong to a culture that has nothing to offer us. Because if they had something to offer us, I would already learned about it in the books and in school, or I probably would have learned about it in television, right? So like, this is related to the idea that I can just take, right? Like I put a link there about the swastika and how it's taken from, the East. And it's just kind of like, why was it so easy to take? Because the other side of the world was so ignorant that they had no idea what it meant. So it didn't matter. So like, see what I'm saying? So like at the end, it's like, the way that I tackle appropriation is by pointing it out. Like, why is that? Ask questions. Why, why are you wearing locks? Well, what does that mean to you? And like, people don't understand what it means and the history of Black hairstyles, right? Or the history of wearing our hair long and braiding it, what that means for a man, an indigenous man, to wear long hair, right? But like, if you're a metalhead, that's fine, it's cool, but if you're an indigenous person going to work, it's like, it's unprofessional, so there's like these, also tattoos, right? That are seen as unprofessional, but there's tattoos that are directly related to tribal identities and history. And like, those are criminalized, and there's a reason why. But like, certain people, it's cool for them to wear these, and for others it isn't, depending also on what you look like and your color. It has a lot to do with it. So I wouldn't say like, okay, I understand what you were saying. I understand that there needs to be inspiration. Like, we need to be able to be inspired by each other, but like, there also needs to be a respect for what we're inspired by, right? Like, in the terms of, well, if the society is not teaching me these things, then I will personally take it upon myself to investigate, knowing that I haven't been given all the information or been exposed to it because of supremacy, And I guess that's maybe that answers part of the question, I guess why it happens, so easily. It's part of the same ordeal, really, the way I see it. You have another question or a comment, Hannah?
Oh, no, yes, I just wanted to further commenting that no, it makes perfect sense, because to me, I think of 3 different angles. The first one is that honestly, we just need to focus on keeping informed and just putting our opinions out there, either by social media or in the work that we do, just kind of positioning ourselves as to, this is what I believe in, why, and just keep informing people around us. Like, I know that every time I learn something that is very important but like bite-sized, I try to tell it to my family, like, for example, your presentation on your tapestry that you're working on and how it tells the legends of the transition of the arrow, the fifth son to the sixth son, has been passed around my family already. And I just told it to my mother, and she just passed it on, and it's one of those things. The second one is, I feel like it's just a signal that we need to slow down, because technology has allowed us to step on it and just like burn the tires, but we're not doing it in a way that it's conscious. It's not like we perfected a technique and we just, used it in automatic. A lot of people are not learning how to drive properly and still stepping on it. So the third one, I think for me, is the one I'm still struggling with, is understanding that plagiarism is not something you see on the syllabus, that it's really hard to do unless like you're very lazy and don't check your sources. Like, it's been a very big concern for me, is starting on my master's, because, like, for example, I'm learning very closely from you, Dr. Gallegos, and from my other, from my chair, and we don't do it in you give me a couple articles and that's it. We have conversation, and for me, it's still a pressure that I'm trying to figure out how to not steal or appropriate someone else's ideas just because we had them in conversation. I'm really trying to trace back my steps. So what did I hear and talk about, and what did I just come up with after what I read? So yes, I feel like trying to address these things not only in academia but between each other, and again, not because we're idiosyncratic and want to control everything, but just to show respect amongst ourselves, so that it will eventually turn into a macro thing that it's normal for people. Because right now the macro idea is people are too sensitive when they're asking for respect. So thank you.
Thank you. We're at the 1:35 mark and I'm starving. No. How are you guys feeling?
We should probably give people their afternoon back.
Yes.
I have to go to campus and advise transfer students in a minute too. So
Me
I
too,
have to run
yeah.
after Doug.
That's right. I'm looking
It
at
seems-
the drive time.
I told you I was going to be my authentic self always, so I'm trying to keep that promise.
Well, perhaps we better end it there, but I'll just quickly say thank you to everybody, especially to Paloma, to Amber, Nicholas, David, obviously to Liliana, who's worked with me on this project, and thanks to the audience too. And Liliana, I'll leave the last words to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for being here, for your time, and for the wonderful conversation that we've had, your talks. I really appreciate the different perspectives and the different angles from which we took this topic. And again, don't forget, we're living coloniality, we're living fascist perspectives and ideas, and we constantly need to be doing the work. If it doesn't feel like we're doing the work, then we're not doing it right, because the world is just so overpowered by dominant cultures in ways that we might not even realize sometimes. And, it's good to hear our friends, where our friends tell us, hey, you know what, you're a little bit one-sided there, like check each other. We should be able to have that with each other as coworkers and as professors and students and as friends. So anyway, I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you, Matthew, so much for inviting me to be part of this and for co-organizing this event with me. I hope you guys have a good afternoon, good rest of your day, and a nice weekend.
Thank you.
For everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Liliana, this
Hi.
is Jan.
Oh, hold on. Let me stop recording real quick.
Okay.